Game begin.
Terabad lost 2-0.
Yeah. That's what
We
happens.
tested last night. Game one is so bad. Actually, just like make this be the podcast.
Well, hello and welcome to Spike Colony Podcast. I am here with first loser, Michael J. Flores. Mike, what happened?
Well, on Tuesday, I went 4-0 at the meetup with the deck you suggested last week's podcast, which was Screen Black Survival. But there were two 4-0s, me and Dave Kaplan. And Dave graciously came to my apartment and we played the matchup for the 5-0 this morning. So last night, if you're a Spike Colony, whatever, like premium subscriber or something, you get to be on our Discord. If you're in that cadre, you know that I went over Andy Levine's house to test the matchup. And Andy was actually like throwing a party at the same time. So we were playing Magic while a party was going on in his apartment, which is like the most Andy Levine thing. If you can imagine Andy Levine's.
Honestly, it sounds new to me. Because he said he had 1,000 people over.
There were like more than 20 people over. Yeah,
I'm like, who are these friends that just like sports and university sports, and none of them play Magic? ?
I don't know if how many of them play Magic. You know, people were curious about what we were doing.
Yeah, he's just sitting in the corner playing cards.
Yeah.
Fun fact: Andy Levine and I were the same year at Cornell.
So game one is super horrendously super bad for black-green survival against mono blue. Dreadnought.
You have no removal spells. Like literal
I had a game.
Nantuko Vigilante end of list. Maybe Tabby in the main, right?
I had a game in testing where I first turn Cabal Therapy, double Dreadnought, and lost on the fifth turn. Like you can't really put up any resistance. On balance, the sideboard games are very lopsided in favor of green black. I mean, it's winnable, right? So I won 0 games, and we switched decks also, right? So I won 0 games in game ones, and the matchup was like more than 75%, I think, in favor of green black in sideboard games. But that's not what happened. Dave came over. I probably should have won game one. I got my sadistic hypnotist down. I had Dave on a 2-turn clock or 3-turn clock with the hypnotist and a ravenous Belloth that I had previously resolved, and I had Nantuko Vigilante down. I was able to resolve it in game one, and he had a dreadnought. My mana was pinned though, so I couldn't use the Vigilante immediately. On my turn,
I'm not following here. So you have a hypnotist on the battlefield, and your opponent put a dreadnought on charmed afterwards.
He had a dreadnought that was vision charmed, so I couldn't use the way that the game played out. I never had an opportunity to use the Vigilante, right? Because like he was sandbagging, and the turn that I had the hypnotist was a very drawn out turn. Where like my last card was a Bird of Paradise that I used to clear out his entire hand, presumably so that I could resolve the Vigilante flip and kill the Dreadnought that he had in play, or that he was going to have in play. But on his turn, he ripped a Vision Charm, and then I ripped a Survival.
Wait, you're still doing a horrible job explaining this. So your opponent has 0 cards in hand.
0 cards in
hand. And you have a face-down Nantuko Vigilante.
But not the mana to use it.
So you just pass. They draw a card.
Dave has a ton of cards in hand, right? At the beginning of the turn, and a phased out dreadnought. Okay, so I can't use my Vigilante now, no matter what. Okay, so my game plan is to empty his hand so that I can use it the next turn. Is that fair?
Yes.
I can't use the Vigilante now. His Dreadnought is not.
That's not. Yeah, okay. That's I'm aligned.
So I empty his hand.
Okay.
He goes to his turn, draws 1 card. Yeah. Right. I go to my turn.
Yeah.
I presumably could have just used the hypnotist to clear his last card, but he's had like a one turn rip, and he has to have drawn either one of 3 remaining Vision Charms or one of 2 remaining Stifles. Right?
Or
Those are
like
the only
Gush, Impulse, like
and Runner, right? So
sure, but
he
it
only
just
has
opens his range.
3 lands in play. So I could have sacrificed my Hypnotist, right, to take one card and then
And then your battlefield would be Baloth Vigilante.
Vigilante, yeah.
So you'd have 7 power on the battlefield
Against 20 life, yeah. Or actually, I think I probably attacked once, maybe.
All right,
16.
so let me do a quick math.
I should have done that.
Right? So we're talking 5 in 40 or whatever versus if you take the quote unquote conservative line, which is actually the deterministic line, right? Because he has to go what? 3 in 40 into
the moral of this story is I should have done that. Okay.
This is so disappointing to me because we spent endless time talking about this matchup, and you were obsessed with this idea that you could use Sadistic Hypnotist to make it so that you never lose the game. And then you're telling me what happened was you had the opportunity to use Sadistic Hypnotist. Here's the other thing, right? Yep. You can just sacrifice Ravenous Baloth to the Hypnotist if you're really worried, right?
Lanny, you don't have to list all the different creatures I could have used to sacrifice Hypnotist to this spot. Then the next turn, I ripped Survival of the Fittest, which probably would have also won the game, but he ripped Counterspell that turn. So he had a 3-outer on the second one. He ripped it. And so the game's going to go at infinite turns anyway, right? Because he can't attack me. If he attacks me, I'll win the race on the counterattacks, but I can't really attack into the 12-12.
You were just living in a world where you just didn't believe your opponent could possibly draw an out instead of living in a world where you can just put your opponent on 0 outs.
Obviously, at that point, I draw 5 straight lands, and he Gush Runner second combos me, which is all 4 of his Dreadnoughts in the top 20.
We're still talking about game 1 here?
Game 1, yeah. So he's all 4 Dreadnoughts in the top 20 off of a Gush Runner. And then in game 2...
But that doesn't matter, because that was after
No, I should have won.
Yeah.
So, and then game 2, I mulliganed. I played game 2 really well, right? Like, I baited him into casting an Unprotected Dreadnought by, like, sandbagging a forest. I naturalized him. I got him, like, 2 or 3 times on just, like, really good gamesmanship. But the end of the day, I drew 14 land and 13 spells, none of which were Survival of the Fittest. So,
your black deck is just going to do that sometimes.
Yeah, the entire game,
how'd you sideboard?
I sideboarded correctly. So I sideboarded minus 5 clunkers. Masticore, Ravenous Baloth, 1 Deranged Hermit, Bone Shredder, and I don't know, some other clunker for Naturalize and
a Faceless Butcher.
Faceless Butcher.
All right, so your deck, you're telling me you sideboarded correctly.
Yeah.
So the remaining offense in your deck after sideboarding, what? 1 Withered Wretch, 1 Yavimaya Elder, 1 Graveborn Muse,
so let me
1 Genesis.
Andy and
End
I
of list.
played the sideboarded games a lot, and I am 100% sure of the statement that I'm going to make. You should not even try to play the games fast, right? So the games where like I could have like opportunistically,
yeah, except for you might only be drawing slightly under curve, right? Because you're saying you drew. Let's just review here. This deck has 28 mana sources, so you're upset that you drew a bunch of lands and like you drew roughly the same amount of lands and spells, and none of your spells were Survival of the Fittest.
My spells included, but action included 1. I mean, I to be fair, I drew 3 Cabal Therapies in this time period, and I was very good at them. And I drew 1 Recurring Nightmare, which got 1 activation before it was foiled. And what'd
you do with the activation? Just draw a card?
I flipped to
Wall Blossoms.
To exchange to Wall of Blossoms when he had 12-12 in play already. So
this is just disgusting. So you're telling me I can't. There's no way the lesson from this. This is what I'm saying about you're so tunnel vision. There's no way the lessons from this is that you did everything correctly. Never.
Game 2, I 100% every part.
You took all the offense out of your deck. You made it impossible to shorten the length of the game.
Listen to me. I had a Deranged Hermit. I still had a 5/5 in my deck. It's bad, by the way. Like that card literally bites you a ton. It's so bad against Gush, and I didn't take quote all the offense out of my deck. You cannot take Wall of Roots out of your deck. The deck does not operate. It doesn't have enough lands. I just drew 14 lands, right? Like I just naturally drew 14 lands. You can't.
I don't know. I
drew three.
I'm telling you, we had the Godfather of the mono blue deck. I'm telling you, we had the. I'm just laying out here.
No. Here's the thing.
Stop. We're talking about the person who's the Godfather of the deck. We're talking about the winning player.
I don't care. People can be wrong.
I understand that people can be wrong, but the thing is, you don't have anything to stand on. You've played whatever amount of matches. 2, you're chasing. You always do this. You're just chasing the evidence that makes you feel good about yourself. You're not living in reality.
I tested a ton sideboard with Andy. The games were like more than 75% in favor of black green. I literally just didn't draw survival. My sideboard, I mulliganed to begin with.
But so that I'm telling you, then
the only action card I drew was a recurring.
Then that's the leak. That's the leak in your analysis, right? So if you put yourself, if you're telling you just like win 75% of this time survival, you're not branching that out. You're not looking for the additional angle. So you're not looking at the game. What do the games look like that you like? Can you win a game without survival? That's the first question.
Yes.
So what's it look like? What does that game look like?
I'm explaining. Yeah. The reason the games are so good after sideboarding is because they can't do anything as long as you draw. So they can't play down to the battlefield because you can just sandbag or discard card, take their cover spell and naturalize them. I did that to Dave 3 times in game 2. I just didn't draw anything that had power.
Because you took it all out of your deck and you refused to add it more. Recurring Nightmare doesn't have power, right? What you're describing can exist in the same universe. This is why I'm so frustrated, because you're just like, I need to have Recurring Nightmare because I can't win. Like I need to be able to shut the door. And then you're like, oh well, I drew Recurring Nightmare, but he already had Dreadnought on the battlefield.
Just to be fair, I only got an activation off Recurring Nightmare because Dave screwed up. He could have foiled it. He didn't. He let me play the first one. He realized after the Wall of Blossoms flop that I was going to draw 4 cards.
That's neither here nor there.
I would have had no action.
That's neither here nor there, because it basically doesn't matter. If he can foil a Recurring Nightmare, he can foil whatever's in its place, right? The only difference is that whatever's in its place could possibly be navigated better because it has it doesn't have to wait for conditions, right? It doesn't have to wait for you to have invested like random wall of blossoms in the battlefield. And then 2, in the world where you go duress naturalize, got your first combo, 5/5 is the second best follow up short of survival of the fittest. Like, and even if it's not 5/5, 4/4 and 1/1 plus 4 2/2s is like totally okay.
Okay, actually, I summarized the games. I had the 5/5 in play at the end of both games. It's irrelevant. Their guys are 12-12.
Okay, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what to tell you. It's fine. I think we should move on from this. It's really not like, this is what I think. I don't know. I'm telling you. I think that you made a very astute observation with the burn primer that you were writing, which was that you were like, I think that the burn deck should pivot into counter sliver, and basically we have a framework that we have for understanding matches against mono blue Dreadnought, and our framework, save for things that should, like, could or would be different, like, is that you want to have some amount of disruption, like any hand that has about 2 disruption spells, so that includes discard plus naturalize, and a clock, which can be basically a 3/3 or better, right?
It can be anything.
Ideally a 4/4, because a 3/3 can get answered by Mishra's Factory, right? If you have a hand containing those cards, you're likely to be a favorite to win the game, because the things that Dreadnought has to do, like, first you cut off the most broken thing, which is them just going turn 2 Dreadnought, right? Because you have double disruption. Double disruption is normally going to take care of turn 2 Dreadnought. If they have turn 2 Dreadnought double backup, then you got not drawn. So we're just taking that out of our range.
If you have a Cabal Therapy,
we're taking that out of our range. Well, if they have double backup, that could just be a foil on Cabal Therapy. It's basically the same thing, right? So if they go foil your Cabal Therapy, counterspell your naturalize, then you're still cooked. So it's plausible that Dreadnought nut draws it out. You take those out of your range. The moment that you put the clock down, then your opponent has less time to sculpt their hand, less time to like spend all their mana casting cantrips until they have 7 cards in hand, like a flash of insight, all the resources, and can start their turn off with a rush. Like this is not new. Let me finish. This is not new information.
You can't just do that.
Look, Mike,
a big part of the game is bluffing that you have removal. You have to just
you're so fixated on that. It's just like the point is like you don't like. I understand that you want to hold your mana up on your opponents, but like you can take a turn to put something on the battlefield because you get double the mana, right? You get to untap, you get to send all your removal. If they have Vision Charm, then you get 2 more untaps, right? Plus they have to get an attack in. Plus a Tempting Wurm plus a Drained Hermit is actually just enough to just stop a Dreadnought, right?
Okay. You're talking about a deck that draws 0 extra cards. You just don't get to cast a Tempting Wurm plus a.
I understand.
That's not possible.
I understand, but I'm just laying out the frameworks. This is the framework that we have. We've talked about this at length. So we've talked about it. Like Dreadnought gets to start their game with like 11 cards in hand, and they're all perfect cards. And the only agency you have over preventing that is to kill them, and that's why Dreadnought beats Landstill.
No, that's not true. Look, this matchup is an Outlast matchup. It's like you always win in the last gear. You just need anything. I managed almost all 4 Dreadnoughts both games, right? I just literally in game 1, I literally should have used my Hypnotist. That's a player error thing, not a strategy error. Okay?
I'm not talking about game 1, right? Game 1, you don't have any control over the narrative of the game. Game 1 is a very simple narrative. You're a deck that has 2 removal spells that cost 1,000 mana, and they're a deck that has Dreadnought, and you're probably going to lose. And you can definitely kneecap them if you have discard plus a fast start. I'm just talking about in game 2, everything we know about the Dreadnought deck points to the idea that you would still want to pair discard with disruption. And
No, you want to pair discard with removal.
Sorry. You want to pair aggression with disruption.
No, that's not the way to win.
Like
I'm telling you, all the sideboarding games either of us lost were based on trying to have initiative before you lock down their hand. The problem is, do you remember when you Iron Man versus the Hulk to me, and you're like good cards beat bad cards?
Yep.
You have to make them be in a situation where they can't win, or they're just going to peel Gush or Impulse. Like Dave cast
Mike, the template for that game was that you had no offense. You did it in our Storm matchup too. Storm was like actually a very similar situation where you were just like you're trying to stop everything, and then all I have to do is cast 1 Factor Fiction. If you pivot to being the Rock, with the survival deck, you've identified something which is very obvious. It's just like you got really into this idea that you were going to play this deck like the Rock, and then you were just like the Rock, except for you have Survival of the Fittest in hand. But if you don't draw Survival of the Fittest, then you're just the Rock. And what happens to what did Dave say about
incidentally draw any? The problem is in game 2. So I obviously didn't give you every detailed game. He had both Mishra's Factories, so I couldn't actually I had at one point my Yavimaya Elder, which I sacrificed because he was never going to get through a Mishra's Factory.
Yeah, because you shouldn't have Yavimaya Elder in your deck in the post-board game. What did I say in the Discord? I said no creatures with 2 power. That's not offense.
Is good.
It's good.
You cannot get out of stage 1 with this deck under pressure.
Yeah,
I don't think you understand that. You literally can't cast your spells.
You can't spend 3 mana to just Manny, you can't spend 5 mana to just do nothing.
I'm telling you, if you don't have the catalyzing creatures, Wall of Roots and Yavimaya Elder, you never get out of stage 1.
No. Yavimaya Elder and Wall of Roots. Yavimaya Elder and Wall of Roots are 2 distinct discussions. If you recall, I didn't tell you to cut Wall of Roots. Okay.
I can tell you, in the spot that I had Yavimaya Elder, I would have never cast Tempting Wurm. I would have lost the game on the spot. It's literally.
I mean, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Mike. I'm sorry, Mike, for what I'm about to say, but I just don't believe you. Like, I think that you are so tunnel visioned on, and I actually appreciate your position because I've been in the same position with you as you before, and I'm telling you that. Like I knew from the moment that we had this discussion that you were never going to change your mind about this, and that's also okay. Like it's totally fine.
I appreciate that you have identified this, and I'm thinking about it a lot. And I'm going to sound like a dick. I have 1,000 times your resume, right? Like I am not a moron at playing Magic.
Mike, just stop. That's not necessary. It's like you said.
Like, I don't believe you. I would have lost the game on the spot if I cast a freaking Tempting Wurm there, right? Like the card is very bad against all.
I mean, you would have to tell me Dave's. You would have to tell me what was in Dave's hand and what was in your hand. Like what would he have put on the battlefield with Tempting Wurm?
At the point that I cast the Yavimaya Elder, I didn't know what was in his hand. I would not have cast it. It was
so. How do you know it would have lost you the game?
That he had access to multiple dreadnoughts at that point. His worst case scenario is he plays 2 dreadnoughts and one eats the other one. He would have crushed me if I made that play. Like that's actually
you're telling me that could have happened, not that it did.
No. When I later looked at his hand, that's what would have happened.
What at what point did you look at his hand?
Like a turn later.
So on turn 4?
Like I don't know exactly
what card were you. Yeah, that's the thing. Is like you don't know exactly the conditions. Maybe at the point where you're looking at their hand, the card that you're casting is Cabal Therapy. Maybe in your hand, your hand contains Tempting Wurm. So you just Cabal Therapy. You name Phyrexian Dreadnought, and then you tap your remaining mana, of which you don't have a lot, but you only need 2, and you put Tempting Wurm on the battlefield.
Maybe this is, I think I cast it on turn 4, but maybe this is a leak on my part. Having played the sideboard games a bunch, I would never cast a naked Tempting Wurm. It is the only sideboarded game I lost.
Right, but it didn't even have to be because it didn't even have to be because it sounded like
testing against Andy. I cast Tempting Wurm. I lost one sideboarded game. It is incredibly bad.
Right, but I'm telling Mike, I'm telling you that you have a gigantic blind spot. You weren't asking yourself the right questions during testing. That's what happens when you win during testing. You don't ask yourself the right questions, right? So like going into testing, you're not asking yourself the right question. Like you have a vision for how things are going to go about, and like I'm literally like writing pages to you about like the possible leaks, that happen. Now I didn't clock that you would lose. I didn't clock that you would lose a game because you didn't draw survival. But I at least had like this fundamental idea, which is that games like this, like games against Dreadnought, are not about what happens. Are not about effectively locking out your opponent, right? They're not even about it. They're not about it in this era anymore because the most powerful card against Dreadnought is the card Meddling Mage, right? And Meddling Mage is like the ultimate like prison card against Dreadnought, which is just like all I'm going to do is I'm going to put Meddling Mage on the battlefield, and then I'm just going to make sure that Meddling Mage never leaves the battlefield. So no matter what happens, even though I draw 1 card per turn or whatever, or I'm a Meddling Mage deck, so I actually I gotta have some selection. I get to cast, whatever other shit is in my deck around Meddling Mage. Like I have this card in this prison, and I'm gonna extend the game, and it's a 2/2, so I get to attack. So all David did was he put 2 Mishra's Factories in his deck and made it so that Meddling Mage couldn't attack, and he was like, "That's okay with me. I am okay if you think that this game is going to be about what happens like 1,000 turns from now." Now, there's a lot of nuance here. One of the things is that Survival of the Fittest and discard give you an extremely robust proactive avenue. People were asking, like, "Oh, how do you beat this mono blue Dreadnought deck?" And basically, I was just like, well, discard is actually really good against this deck. And they're like, well, why is discard good against it? Like, what's the difference between discard and counterspell? It's like, well, discard, you can use it proactively. And if you are proactive with discard and you use your discard to get Tempting Wurm on the battlefield or Survival of the Fittest on the battlefield, now you have a permanent, and the mono blue deck is really bad at answering permanents. It only has 3 Chain of Vapor.
It's good at answer. Well, it doesn't. I mean, Dave had a Chain of Vapor in the sideboarding games. We talked about it. I'm like, I don't think you should have that. I think you should have a Misdirection. And Andy cited Misdirection, and the Misdirection's good because one of the problems for the deck is it has a hard time winning any sideboard.
You're arguing a point which is irrelevant to the point that I'm making, because I'm just saying permanents are good against. I'm saying permanents are good against Dreadnought, right?
Permanents in the abstract are not, including the 5/5 Tempting Wurm. They answer your permanents by racing you with a 12/12.
Right, but so their ability to do that is handcuffed if the nature of your disruption is discard, because you get the ultimate last word, right? So if you play a discard spell against them and you have a read on the situation, like you're able to do what you need. And then secondly, Survival of the Fittest is a permanent, and it's a great card to resolve behind discard. I don't understand why you would disagree with that. Yeah. And then secondly, the point that I'm making is Chain of Vapor is not a good answer to survival, which you just make a statement and agree with. So let me continue what I was saying. It's like, Discard's really good because you got to maintain a proactive game plan. So all I'm telling you, and I think at this point we probably didn't provide the listeners enough context, but you said it with your sideboard plan, right? You basically cut Masticore. I agree with cut Baloth. I'm on the fence with cut Deranged. I think is strictly wrong. And then you just bring in 4 Naturalize and a faceless Butcher.
So your main problem with me that as I took out a Deranged Hermit instead of a Wall of Roots.
No, you should have taken out. You should have taken out the Recurs. You were basically saying like I need Sadistic Hypnotist, Genesis, and Recurring Nightmare in order to end the game.
Legitimately a good threat, and one of the reasons
but here's the thing:
your artifact destruction.
Recurring Nightmare doesn't actually do anything unless you somehow manage. I would die on this hill. That's how certain I am on that. I know you're certain, Mike. I know you're certain. You don't have to tell me how certain you are. You don't have to tell me how certain you are. You don't have to tell me about your resume.
Only on theory crafts. We tested multiple sideboarding strategies.
This is a good Mike. One. I understand. Like I'm making a point. Okay. I could be wrong. I might not have the key. Like I'm actually just telling you something that could, like, you can also just like incorporate a mix, right? So I completely understand, like, because at the end of the day, it wasn't my game, right? It was your game. Like, you get to play the match how you want, and you got to tailor it to the things that you're comfortable with. I'm just identifying the shortcomings of planning around something like Recurring Nightmare.
I'm not hearing you. I actually want to understand something, but do you understand stage theory? Right, like that. Like there's the concept in Magic called stage theory. Chapin called it phase theory. Right, you need to have a certain minimum number of cards in some decks, or you can't play your fundamental game.
Right, but you're treating this like that's the thing, is like this is just a feedback loop, because you believe in this thing, right? And you're basically putting yourself in a position, but this is just a heuristic. What you're describing is just a heuristic. Like, it has very obvious shortcomings, and it contains nuance. So what you're saying might broadly be true, and I could just make a simple argument. It's like, okay, well, if you believe in this idea of stages, I have a very simple answer for you, which is just that you win if you have Survival of the Fittest on the table, because Survival gets you Genesis and Sadistic Hypnotist, and you can't lose games where you have Genesis and Hypnotist that go long. So why do you need Recurring Nightmare? That's all.
So I would say I lose. That's not how I'm thinking about it, so I don't want to respond to that, right? You're just like, I'm going to assign all of these things to you, and then you have to answer the question that I have, but which is actually not the thing that I want to do, okay? So I lose 100% of the games that are decided in the first 5 turns. Like, that is literally there's no universe where I can win the games that are not in the first 5 turns. I have to elongate the game in a certain way, whether or not I draw Survival of the Fittest, and then be able to operate through the increase of resources. Recurring Nightmare is a resource increasing card. This promotes every aspect of my game plan. When you say it doesn't do anything on its own, it's not really true. I'm not going to draw no creatures. Every Recurring Nightmare exchange is an increase of my resources, even if it's not power, right? If all I'm doing is flipping a Yavimaya Elder, I'm actually promoting the things that are going to make me, you know how, like in poker, where they're like, your hand improves or gets worse when they're showing like the ESPN check mark. This always makes my meter go up. You're saying, okay, you should play these cards, but the problem is the cards are bad in many situations.
Right, but Recurring Nightmare. But the thing is, you're just saying Recurring Nightmare is good in all situations. I'm telling you the opposite.
It is positive in all situations.
Yeah, that's not true, because the nuance that you're leaving out is that your opponent gets to do things too, right? So fundamentally, what's happening with the Recurring Nightmare is that you are maybe drawing a card for 3 mana, if and only if you have stuff in certain zones, right? So flipping Wall of Roots.
No, there's another nuance, which is that, and this Dave sideboarded the way I thought that he would, which is to have a lot of annuls, right? So even if I had drawn, Survival, I had to wait until I could Cabal Therapy all of his annuls, which I did. But in testing, a bunch of the times, what I would do is play a Recurring Nightmare to draw out an annul, and then cast the Survival.
All right, I'm going to ask you if you're familiar. Are you familiar with the concept of synergistic versus non-synergistic, right? So like cards that are codependent, right? So Survival of the Fittest is, thanks to the construction of your deck, a standalone threat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Recurring Nightmare is not.
It has to have a creature.
No. You're oversimplifying because the investment ratio is a lot different for Recurring Nightmare and Survival, right? Survival costs 1 to activate. You can do it immediately the turn that it happens. You can do it at instant speed. Et cetera, et cetera. Like the recurring, and the upside is huge, right? Because survival, you're tutoring, and recurring nightmare at best. And again, this is at best. This is like the 2 Wall of Roots scenario. You're saying a creature, it's a creature in the graveyard, a creature in the battlefield, and both those creatures have to want to be in the other place, right? So if it's just like Birds of Paradise for Wall of Roots, you're not really doing anything.
I agree. If it's in the Birds of Paradise for Wall of Roots, I'm not doing
because you have if you have a warm-bodied opponent that is also using their mana, that's not just like sitting there watching you spin your recurring nightmare, like you're not actually doing anything, right? So like you're very, very familiar with this concept because we talked earlier about a game where the opponent is playing burn, right? So what does it feel like to spin your recurring nightmare when you're playing against burn? It's like it's only good if you have Ravenous Baloth, and even then it's 6 mana for 4 life.
Well, I mean, that's not true. There's a lot of it depends, right? Like if there's a recurring nightmare in this deck versus
Mike,
the Rock, they could just make all walls and I'll never damage them.
Mike, just you understand the discomfort that's associated with spending all your mana drawing cards if your opponent is burn, right?
Yeah, but there's nothing to do with the match.
Mike, it does, because like the fact of the matter is that like the Dreadnought deck has the agency to behave like burn because all of its cards fundamentally deal damage to their opponent, just in like a very oblique way. And the reason why that's valid, and the reason why that's really important, is because it's not a deck that you can actually outgrind. Like
exactly a deck.
It's not if you are exchanging. If your exchange rate on cards is 3 mana for a blank card, it's different if the exchange is different, right? So for example, if you can play 3 mana and you put something like Aura of Silence on the battlefield, right? That changes everything. If you can put Meddling Mage on the battlefield, that changes everything. But we discussed that at length. But if all you're doing is putting Recurring Nightmare into play and you're flipping around your Wall of Blossoms, then you're kind of doing nothing. So that's like one universe, but that's actually not the important universe. The most important universe is actually super obvious, which is that you have an Utabi Orangutan in your graveyard, and now all of a sudden the Recurring Nightmare is super important. And I buy that. That's like totally good. But the only problem with that is that you're living in a universe where you have late game resources associated with having had a survival in play, and you like then that just means
late game resources because you didn't lose the game.
Then that just means it's one Utabi. You have 1 copy of Tabby and you have 4 copies of Survival of the Fittest, right? That's like all I'm saying. Like
no, but this is just the range. You talk about this all the time. You just draw different combinations.
Yeah, I understand. That's my point. Is that it's actually you actually have a much more advantageous range when you have Tempting Wurm in your deck than Recurring Nightmare. And I understand where you're coming from. You are so scared to lose the game on the spot to Tempting Wurm that you won't do something which is,
I won't wildly play a Tempting Wurm on turn.
Yeah, but no. I mean, actually this is like pretty easy to define, right? So if we just had, in our chart that Tempting Wurm on turn 2 either wins the game for you, like puts you at a 75% favor to win the game versus 25% to lose the game. Like, and it's not 25%. You're talking about 2 Phyrexian Dreadnoughts in hand, which is a 1 in 4, 1 in 3 parlay with like having seen.
No, there's already a Dreadnought dead. I killed one already because I juked.
Mike, I'm talking about in the abstract, right? Because we're talking if we're talking about range, if we're talking about ranges, right? You're building your deck in the second game, like based on the pantheon of things that can happen. Now, fundamentally, if you can, instead of drawing a card that puts you in grave danger about 5% of the time, right? You might be so risk averse that you never want to lose the game on the spot 5%, because losing the 5%, getting the suck out on the 5%, the double Dreadnought thing is going to feel so bad, because in your mind, right, you could have simply drawn Recurring Nightmare instead of Tempting Wurm.
But Lane,
and Mike, let me finish.
I have to accept that I have a plus 50% chance of even winning the game that I guess.
No. But
which is preposterous.
It's not. It's not. If your opponent, like, it's the same thing as if you had Hidden Gibbons, right? If you just have a creature on the battlefield that they can't navigate around, like, you're putting them on a 4-turn clock, they can't even race. Once that Tempting Wurm connects 3 times, right, they can't attack. So by turn 6, they're handcuffed unless they answer this card. And guess what? One of their only answers are Chain of Vapor and Powder Keg. And Powder Keg takes 2 turns to load up. And it also costs 2. Like, so maybe they can get you.
What if they just have 1 Dreadnought and any enabler? Now you're giving them the first Dreadnought attack in your mana's tap.
I mean, again, you can argue the range, and I think that's totally valid. Like, I think it's totally valid. Like, you could be in a situation.
You never win that game. That's why I
Mike, I understand. But, like, if you're going down that path, then you have to be like, okay, then I blanked on discard at any point in the game. So
not at any point in the game.
At any point in the game surrounding your Tempting Wurm.
Yeah, but the problem is, like,
I have a very
I'm just good. I don't know how to explain
I have a very simple point, which is just that, like Tempting Wurm can do effectively what Recurring Nightmare does, but Recurring Nightmare can never do what Tempting Wurm does. And the reason that is because they both have the same effective, like, unanswered, like, win rate when resolved, like, thing. So all the same things that fight Tempting Wurm are effectively the same that fight Recurring Nightmare. In fact, your opponent's range against Recurring Nightmare is increased if you think they have a null. So
no, I as I said, I used Recurring Nightmare as a duress for a null in order to resolve survival.
Right. But
multiple times.
Again, I'm saying
that's very good, not bad.
No, that's like using it's like using 3 mana to counter a 1 mana spell, and then you're still
you're just literally. You're ignoring the fact that I have designed my life in this matchup.
No.
I'm
not ignoring.
They have 2.
I'm not ignoring that fact.
That's how all the games play.
I'm telling you I'm not ignoring that fact. I'm saying that designing your life around this has leaks. Like, I'm telling you that, like. So say you adopt this strategy. Like, I'm telling you that you're going to lose as many games to drawing too thin as you are to, like, some sort of, like, weird Tempting Wurm doomsday scenario.
You will never convince me of that. The Banesian is so far in favor of.
But you're just saying that, though. You don't know, right? And I'm not saying that I know. I'm just saying that you've literally shut out, like, you want to shut out this concept because you, like, it's just emotional. It just doesn't fit into the narrative. It is. I think that it is.
I'd like to shift this a little bit if we bring it back. So I think that this deck is viable only because people stopped playing Red Green Oath, right? Fran's response was this deck is quite good against Red Green Oath, and he explained why he thinks so, right? And he thinks, like, well, you're just going to activate the Oath, and then they're gonna Bone Shredder your Terravore, and well,
did you watch the matches that he played?
And Pyroclasm isn't good. So I looked at this and I'm like,
Mike, did you watch the matches that he played?
I did not watch.
Well, maybe you should start with that, right?
But this is like you think that I have a leak on endgames. I think people just don't think about endgames. I don't see how I could lose, right? You just Pyroclasm the Birds of Paradise and pin all the black mana. Like, you do nothing else. Let them have all the green mana in the world. They can never win. Because your Terravore is bigger than everything in their deck except for a Bone Shredder. Just don't reveal it until you pin all their black mana. Like, they literally can't win.
So I'm sitting there and you're stopping all the black mana. I'm sitting there and I've just got green mana, right?
Yeah.
And so you put a Terravore into play. You hard cast it
no, I oath it because your deck can't operate without creatures in play.
All right. So conceivably you oathed it, and you do have first to act advantage, right? Because you have Oath and I have to have Naturalize, right? But if I naturalized it, then we're having a different.
In game 1, you don't even have Naturalize.
Right. But you're saying that you're deciding the Dreadnought matchup in games 2 and 3. I assume that you would give yourself the same credit in the Red Green Oath matchup.
Well, so I was just answering 2 things.
So you were just answering if you win game 1.
No. I was the response that I got was a game 1 response, right? So
no. Who fucking cares?
Sure.
Like, it's just you're saying your thesis is that this deck loses to Red Green Oath, but you only want that thesis to stand on Red Green Oath winning game one. That doesn't make any sense.
No, that's fine. You will gain resistance in sideboard games.
Yes. Okay. So what's your strategy in the sideboard games?
A variation on the same. Whether or not I'm
so what do you do? But what do you do
oathing,
if your opponent draws an answered oath?
Well, so their answer to the oath is naturalize.
It's naturalized Tranquil Domain, and then conceivably,
I have Tranquil Domain, but Phil didn't have Tranquil Domain. But I mean, am I my deck? I don't know the anyway.
In addition to Duress Cabal Therapy. So if it's Duress Cabal Therapy under the wire, then you get gotten, and then after the wire, it's naturalized.
My problem with this deck in the Red Green Oath matchup is
which you've never played.
Is that if you play the Red Green Oath matchup side correctly, they can't cast any spells. Their deck has 20 lands, and they can only get out of being stuck with 20 lands by triggering your oath. You can literally just put them in a situation.
Right, but what if they Duress or Cabal Therapy or naturalize your oath?
But what if I start with so they can do that, right?
Right.
But
they can do that. They can do that game one on the play.
But the sum total of all of my stuff, which includes just the mana destruction, the Sylvan libraries, which are not being pressured because the deck doesn't have very much offense until the mid game, and the Sphere of Resistance can make it so they can't actually do anything once we get to the mid game.
Without oath.
I can just cast a Terravor at some point. They can't answer it.
Right, but
they have to have sandbagged a swamp. Okay, so if they sandbag a swamp and have a Bone Shredder in their hand, then they can interact one time. They get one interaction point in the entire game. Explain to me how I'm wrong.
Well,
tell me the thing they can do. If okay, you got my first Terravor. I hardcast my second.
Mike, I'm just telling you that it's like very simple, right? Because like there's many universes that you can live in. You're basically saying that you have everything on the Red Green Oath side, but remember, you're still a 28 land deck with 4 Mox Diamond, right? So, the extent to which like your whole analysis work actually pivots entirely around 4 copies of Oath of Druids and 4 copies of Terravor. Listen, because Sylvan Library, its only job is to draw those 2 cards, because the rest, if you don't have Oath of Druids in play, your opponent, you can't get past a copy of Wall of Blossoms. You can't actually do anything about the game. So then your entire ability to win is completely dependent on those 8 cards in your deck. Okay?
Technically, my ability to reduce my opponent to 0 life, yes, is hinged on a certain number of cards.
Right. So let's. So that's.
However, that's not my ability to win. I'm putting this in air quotes. I can just draw your discount is something. You're just like, you have everything, they have nothing. That's not true. I have time. Both decks are designed to play for a long time.
Right, but a single survival of the fittest makes it extremely hard for you to operate, right?
No, that's not true. If I have a Sphere of Resistance in play, right? They can't easily operate. Their deck has 20 lands.
Right, but they have the benefit. They have the benefit of the time, because what you would just do with survival of the fittest, again, like, once you have survival, then you can suppress Oath. You can also survival through Sphere of Resistance just because you survival for mana. You just survival into more copies of Wall Roots, and like you're saying that Sphere of Resistance is buying you time. Sphere of Resistance is buying them time. Like, it doesn't buy anyone time, actually. It's just you're just committing a card to like maybe slow them down, but you're down a card because you have Sphere of Resistance, and they have a card draw engine that's like giving them straight gas.
So there are more in game one. Start with game one. There are more universes where I have Active Oath than I don't have Active Oath. Right.
I mean, I don't think that's necessarily true, because you're playing.
The number of answers
you're playing.
The top of my library is less than the number of access that I have to Oath.
That's not necessarily true. So one, you don't have Oath in all of the situations where you don't start on the play with Mox Oath, and they don't start on the play with discard. And then 2, you have to draw the Oath if you're drawing it off the top before your opponent draws Survival of the Fittest, right? Because our entire thing is that Oath stops your opponent from developing. And I absolutely agree with you. I think that Wall of Roots is a horrendous matchup against the card Oath of Druids. It's so horrendous that I would give you a ton of points in your favor. I would give you like I would give you like 30 points. I would give you like, okay, like, you know, if you get that Oath of Druids down, like your opponent is in super trouble, right? Because they're going to start putting Terravores in play, and there's not much that they can do. However, like the ways in which they have to interact with it are actually at least plausible. Now, one, we're talking 10 black sources, you know, plus the 4 Birds of Paradise.
8 black sources and 4 Birds of Paradise.
Yeah, I'm looking at 10. There's 6 swamps.
and 10, 4. You're right. Sorry.
Yeah. So I'm looking at 10 black sources. So that's not like, you know, 10 by 8 is not the most exciting thing in the world. But that all that has to do is cut into your, you know, what is it? Is it 40% or 60%? I always forget. I should know. Do you know the number?
What you're referring to. I don't know what you're referring to.
The chance that you have a 4 of in your opening hand.
Oh, it's like a little over 40%. It's way less than 60%. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. It's 40%. So 40%. So already 60% of the time, like you might just have to mulligan, right? Because if you don't have Oath of Druids, like what are you doing? Like you have nothing, right?
So you don't think that like hands with multiple mana disruption or hands with Sylvan Library are in the keepable range?
Not
like,
really.
I actually think that I win all the games so long.
I'm willing to add Sylvan Library into the mix, but Sylvan Library is like super sketch, right? Because if you Sylvan, then you don't get in, then they develop their mana. Like I don't think your Ponza plan is good against. Fundamentally, based on everything,
they develop their mana. That doesn't happen by itself.
They have 28 mana sources. They have 28 mana sources, survival of the fittest, and they can counter if they're worried about it, they can counter Stone Rain with Duress, right?
By the way, this is a 20 land deck. The average game on the play, you stop on your second land unless you have a catalyst. You just don't have your
right, but land. You have 28 total mana sources.
If you
stop on 2, you have Wall of Roots.
No. If I'm just on the play, okay,
which is only 50% of the time.
Oh no. But I'm just starting, okay? If I'm just on the play, I can have Rishodon Port or Sphere of Resistance, and you never get off the ground because
only if you start on 2. Like it's still a bell curve, and you get a mulligan, right?
Well, Mulligan's getting. This is an increasingly bad matchup. Do you want to start talking about Mulligans?
No, it's not because once again, like all the survival player has to do is fade Oath. So it becomes a very easy game if all you have to do is fade.
True. There's like I can't believe I'm the one who's defending the Oath Ponza deck. You were just like, oh, Oath Ponza is so good. You told John it was the best deck in pre-modern at one point. The basic operations of Oath Ponza are so far ahead of the basic operations of the black-green deck. Right? Like what if I just draw three land destruction?
I told you this.
You cannot cast a spell.
I'm telling you that's the reason that works is because the opposing decks don't have 28 mana sources. Like fundamentally, they just don't, because not a lot of decks have 28 mana sources.
Okay, so when you say they have quote 28 mana sources, 4 of those are Birds of Paradise. Okay, one of Fran's arguments is that Pyroclasm is bad against this deck. It's very good against Birds of Paradise. Secondly,
it's not. It's very good against multiple copies on the battlefield. Like, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Trading a 2 mana removal
all you're trying
spell.
to do is make it so your opponent can't cast the things that matter.
Yeah, I understand, but here's like basically the counterpoint to that. Like the point is pretty simple. Is just that you can't do this forever, right? So
no, you only need to do it for a turn or two because your Terravore will kill them.
No, you have to get to the Terravore, and your opponent has to stumble, right? Like the reason
they have one answer to a Terravore.
We live in the same world because like basically one of the hard matchups for red green Ponzo was the black white control matchup, right? And fundamentally that was very confusing to people because they're like, black white control looks like a very similar deck to Landstill, and it's like, well, actually it isn't, right? Because like,
but it's 1,000 mana and 4 Swords of Plowshares.
Yeah, there's 1,000 mana. So the reason why I bring that up is actually pretty simple, which is just that the 1,000 mana is a good start point. So it's something that helps the replenish deck if it has 26 mana sources, right? Because it starts 26 mana sources, and it's also gonna loot into more mana. So like replenish, and it has soul lands, right? Like, I think that this deck, while it doesn't have soul lands and it doesn't have Eternal Dragon, which obviously gets under Sphere of Resistance and gets you a sturdier mana source, an unwastelandable mana source, or an unpyroclasmable mana source, like, I still think that this deck is quite good, like in that scenario. And it helps that when players actually sleeved up and they're playing against warm-blooded opponent instead of just theorizing about it, like, it actually came to 4, that it was at least close. So at least close is actually totally fine in our world, right? Because you're basically making the argument that this shouldn't exist in any metagame that Red Green Ponza does. And like Phil's been playing this at least through an amount of metagame that has Red Green Ponza. So whether or not the matchup is, I don't know, how many points would you give Red Green in the match?
I think it's got to be 70-30 at least in favor of Red Green.
I think that's, I don't think I have to actually fight that hard to get it down to 55 or 60, right? Because 70 is insane. Like 70 we're starting to get into like Enchantress Burn numbers. Like, I mean, what do you have Tide versus Burn?
Mono Blue Tide versus Burn in game 1.
No. Why?
Oh,
stop! Why do you say game 1? Who cares?
I don't know. I think it's probably 85%.
Stop bringing up game 1. So it's 85-15, and then Andy finds
85-15.
So Andy's probability of losing there is 1 in 100, or 1 in whatever. It's 1 in
like a
it's 1 in 75 or something.
No, it's like 144.
What?
Hold on.
This is simple math now.
It's actually closer to 1 in 50. It's 2.25.
Land could do it. Yeah. So it's
it's 1 in 50.
Yeah. So it's 150 for him to like lose 2 matches.
So that's actually the point that I was going to make. Like I tested I tested to the point that I didn't feel like testing anymore, right? And like, but it's not 100% matchup, and I got a little unlucky. Like I screwed up in game 1. I'm just super willing to concede. I should have won game 1 probably. Okay. But then, like, I just got a little unlucky in it. It's like a 75% match. It means you lose 1
Like, I understand. Like, sometimes the run out is bad for you. And in fact, fundamentally, everything that I suggest makes it entirely plausible that, you know, I'm giving 10 to take 10 back, right? So everything I'm describing, whatever happens, maybe I'm making my late game so bad that I'm giving up like 10 points in the late, like, you know, 10 points in games, whatever. Whatever framework you have, it just comes down to like that win rate. I earned 10 points in one direction and 10 points in the other direction. Like, and that's totally fine. I think that people make a lot of decisions that are essentially a wash. Like, you know, like I think that you should play 4 intuition and replenish. And a lot of people think that you should play 3 intuition and replenish. And the fact of the matter is, whatever I gain from playing the 4th could be over the course of 1,000 matches exactly the same as somebody playing 3 and just a stifle instead of the 4th intuition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's totally like, you know, that's totally fine. Like, I think that you earn more because, like, I think that, you know, everything we've learned about the Mono Blue Dreadnought deck basically says paying 3 mana to draw, like, spend your time drawing cards is not like the recipe for beating the deck. Like,
so, can I pause you for a second? One of the things that you said to me was just like, we had Dr. Surf and Surf on, and he said you can't outgrind this deck. And so your principle is based on believing Rascal when he said that. I am telling you, the black-green deck is vastly favored in games that go long. You want to outgrind them. And so you're just like, oh, well, Rascal said this, but he never had to play against a survival deck that had this many different points of attack. Right, like
right. But in order for that to be true,
it's a completely different universe than any deck that he'd actually tested
against. I'm accepting of that, but the thing is, in order for that to be true, it has to be true, and also like I'm telling you, you're just not giving up late game, right? By taking Recurring Nightmare out of your deck. That's like everything. You're not giving up late game. You have all the same late game tools. You have Genesis. You have Hypnotist. You have Graveborn Muse, I guess, right? And you don't. Like,
I drew a Graveborn Muse in game 2. It was just countered.
Yeah, whatever. So countered is the best the card can effectively hope for. And like, all I'm saying is that your potential, your ability to pull all of that out of your deck is not actually lessened by taking Yavimaya Elder and Recurring Nightmare out of the deck. Like, you still have 95% of the late game capabilities. And like, what you gain by taking, like, instead of improving your late game by like whatever, like, you can improve your, like, oh, like, I have Duress Tempting Wurm, and like, I can actually run out of Tempting Wurm, and I can play on turn 6, right? Because you're here and just like, well, all I have to do is turn 20. And I'm like, okay, well, how about you have a mix? How about you have Gears? How about you have I have turn 7 and I have turn 20, because you don't need much to achieve turn 20. All you need to do is ever resolve survival, and your deck has the same tools to do that. And adding a 3 mana duress to make it possible for you to resolve survival is like not as good as having a turn 7 like at a 100% rate higher than you did, because you have none of that in your deck.
So I would agree with you if that were true, but it's just not true. Like Tempting Wurm is very bad. It's very
right,
good.
But it doesn't even. But the thing is, I don't even know. Like if you have the discard spell, it's good, right? Like I don't know.
It's not. The problem is even when you have the discard spell, right? It depends which discard spell you have and what information you have. A bunch of times, I've seen and I've played situations where you had the discard spell and then it creates volatility because they have a gush you didn't take, right? So like. If you'd be like, okay, I'm going to take the gush instead of the counter spell when I want to resolve the Tempting Wurm, that doesn't make any sense.
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay, then I just don't cast the Tempting Wurm, or I just get
you can you can cast the Tempting Wurm and get a counter.
So that wasn't.
And then they don't have gush. How is that play not in your range?
I had today.
If your opponent has Factor Fiction and Counterspell, which one do you take?
Counterspell, in fact, it depends on a lot of things. Oftentimes, I'll take the counterspell. Oftentimes, I'll take the Factor Fiction.
Right. Okay. So if you address your opponent and they have, I mean, I don't know. What if they're
if my hand has Survival of the Fittest?
Also, their hand shouldn't. Sorry, we need to rewind. Their hand doesn't contain Counterspell because you freely duress them, right? Like they just counter the duress.
I'm just saying the problem. Most of the time,
that's just not a good scenario. I know
that I've seen this card erupt is because they had a gush.
Gush that's totally fine. And I'm actually fully set. They have the opportunity to conceivably bless. In fact, that's my nightmare scenario. And I did some testing of the sort when I was playing the Rock versus Stasis. I was testing it with Will Hurst, and basically I was like really 50-50 on Tempting Wurm, and I was just like, well, I feel like I'm going to Tempting Wurm and they're going to gush and get it down. And Stasis is obviously
Tempting Wurm in the sideboard, not this deck, right?
What's that?
Deck. This deck or
no, Lanny Rock.
But we just had Tempting Wurm in the sideboard.
Yeah. We had 4 Tempting Wurm in the sideboard for burn.
No. I was just clarifying. I didn't
know so I would just run out in a normal rock deck, not the survivalist rock deck. I just run out Tempting Wurm, and it would just work out it turned out to work out for me because the way resources were getting traded like through the mid game. So obviously Stasis doesn't have turn 2 combo, so things are definitely a little different. But like. We're just getting into like this weird mid-game resource trading where he has to keep Pernicious Deed off the battlefield, and like various tools. And, in the mid-game, it's very hard for them to accumulate resources because they have to spend mana. And if they're trying to manage what you're doing, what your proactive plan in the mid-game, then their resources are mixed, right? So if you're shipping Tempting Wurm, into like if you duress them, you might duress them on turn 1 and see Counterspell and not gush, right? And then Tempting Wurm's incredible because their hand at that point is very likely to just be cantrips, and then
you just get them.
Yeah, I mean you live in that, but the thing is that can happen on turn. That can happen on turn 1 too. That's obviously the dream, but that can happen on like turn 5. On turn 5. You might have just turn 5, you might have had like an awkward run out. You might have been like forced Birds of Paradise. Then you might have been like, Survival of the Fittest, get it countered. And then going into turn 3, you like top deck Cabal Therapy or Duress, and you have like a Tempting Wurm hand. Like,
so this is completely irrelevant, but that's what I did when I played my Tempting Wurm today. He had cantrips. I played the Tempting Wurm. The cantrips became a Dreadnought, and then my Tempting Wurm was irrelevant, right? Like that, like. But that's it's pointless. You're right. Like the Tempting Wurm happened, but it just didn't do anything. Would I have rather had a recurring nightmare there? Yeah, probably, because then I would be able to use resources that I had in order to try to get to a situation where I wouldn't just lose to the Dreadnought that he cast.
Yeah, I mean, and that's fine.
Tempting Wurm is like
and that's fine, and it's actually like it's a kind of a believable place to be. Because you have this framework, which is like the worst thing that can happen to me is getting mana flooded, and that is what happened to you. And then you lost, and then you chalk it off to being unlucky. But I'm just saying that.
Well, I was definitely unlucky, and it doesn't matter. I should have won game 1, right? So I'm not blaming my loss on unluckiness. I'm just like I was unlucky, right? I think I have a good matchup after sideboarding, and I didn't win.
Right. I fully understand.
Range, right? Like so. But
that's the thing is like I'm saying it's more likely for you. It's actually very good for you to remove some amount of your ability to lock up the end game in order to give you something to do besides play for that end game. Because
I have a Tempting Wurm in my deck. I just don't have hella Tempting Wurms in my deck. Drawing a bunch of Tempting Wurms early is not good. That's what I'm.
It's actually better. It's actually better than just drawing one, right? Because the second one doesn't do anything.
It's just like the unhappiness of the second child. Like,
so it's like really awesome.
All the unhappiness.
So now you actually have 2/5/5s, and your ability to race is super great, right? And then the only way that you lose is if you get busted.
So, not that we're a pro analogy podcast, but Tempting Wurm is like the credit card game. When I was young, and I, not that young, I was probably already a kid, but everybody else didn't have a kid yet, and they didn't have a partner up yet. I went to a very expensive John Finkel birthday party dinner that I probably couldn't have afforded at the time. It ended up being like $200 a head, right? But I had enough cash in my pocket that I could pay my way, and I'm like, I was very tempted to play the credit card game because like all these guys are like to run the adrenaline. And
the credit card game, for people don't know, is that you go out to dinner, you randomize who pays the bill.
Yeah. So it was $220 a head, and this was a big table, right? So a lot of traders and stuff at this table, and I'm like, I'm so unlikely to lose the credit card game.
Man, you're really bad at math.
Yeah. So Tony Sai stops me. He's like, we are both just going to pay our way. And Tony's actually one of John's partners, right? Like, he's just like, and I'm like, no, I'm very unlikely to lose. And he's like, that's true. You're like 90% unlikely to lose. The problem is, in the cases that you lose, you get busted so bad, it's not worth it for you, right? Some people, they could shrug it off. It just doesn't matter. The amount of adrenaline they got from playing the credit card game, they don't care about the $2,000 Amex bill, right? They just don't care. But for you, it matters. That's what Tempting Wurm is.
This is actually a really excellent analogy, and it does distill something that I think fundamentally is the nature of the leak in your game, because you think that you're playing with effectively a finite bankroll. So one of the most
I'm playing with a finite bankroll,
right?
Not effectively a finite bankroll.
Well, sorry. You're playing with no bankroll, or you're just not well bankrolled, right? You're not playing with enough bankroll. So one of the simplest things. This is like Econ 101, right? Is just like, are you gonna take? Would you take 75% to double your net worth and 25% to lose it all, right? And
that super depends on where you are in life, right? So that's the right play. For
no. I mean, it's sort of just meant to illustrate the. I guess I don't know why they brought it up in econ class, because
I'll actually tell you that this is a Tversky thing. So like the same psychologist who came up with the analogies are intellectually weak, invented this, and they talk about it now because he invented it in the 1970s.
Okay,
right. It's called decision theory.
Okay,
right. So
I mean, this is just simple from like a pure mathematical standpoint. You always take the bet
now,
and
right? And Tversky invented it.
Yeah. Right? They were basically saying it's like, okay, well, this is just used to be in the context that I learned it was just like people fundamentally don't understand math, and actually the truth is
fundamentally risk averse in terms of
well, no, people fundamentally understand bankroll, right? So like, your ability to take the bet actually doesn't scale with your network. Well, I mean, it's much worse as your network, whether it's always the same. You always have the same equity percentage rise, right? But like, if you have $100 net worth, then at least you have the bankroll of time, which is that you can make it back, right? And if you have a $10 million net worth, then you would just like never take it, because the amount of time for you to make it back.
Landy, like I said, it really depends on a lot of context.
Exactly.
Also, if you can take the bet 100 times, you should take it. But
exactly.
If you can only take it
and
once,
you can take,
which is what most people are in the situation.
And this is how bankroll works, right? So if you have a bankroll, you can take continually larger and larger favorable bets. So this is just trading, right? And when you talk about how it feels to get blown up by Tempting Wurm, you're talking about effectively what goes all the way back to Sam Black Dreamblade, right? Which is that opponents...
No. This is a very bad example.
The Dreamblade example is great.
No, it's a bad example because Sam Black Dreamblade, that was the best bet that guy was going to get. Right?
Exactly.
Sam wouldn't take it because from Sam's situation where he has equity,
right. No, this is
that guy's unlikely to win. Your presumption on Tempting Worm when I compare it to the credit card game is that it's a fair bet. The credit card game is a fair bet. It's not a good bet. It is a fair bet. The problem is Tempting Worm is not a fair bet. You don't win 90% of the time and get blown out 10% of the time. You are like
no.
A 5-5 in play.
If that were the case,
getting blown out.
No. I mean, I'm literally like I think that that's obviously debatable, and I would just melt it. Like I would just melt it in, right? Like I have basically a my risk assessment is much lower than yours, and my gains assessment is much higher, right? So like, but that aside, the fact that there is risk is why it's a Sam Black Dreamblade situation, because Sam Black in Dreamblade is not in a position where he needs to take on any additional risk. And I actually think that you think of yourself like that when you play pre-modern. I think that you think of yourself like that when you play pre-modern globally. Like I think that you have Sam Black Dreamblade edge. And I think that the reality is that you should take more shots. And this is an example of you should take more shots, because I think you're very comfortable with play patterns that are effectively low risk, right? Like Sam Black had a spell book in his Miri's Guile deck, and I thought that was just like completely illustrative of like the entire thing that I've basically been saying this the entire time. It's like these guys are so confident in their ability to play a game with 6 cards in hand if it means that they can have 15 cards in hand on turn 20.
So
right.
I let me address the thing that you just said. I think you're right most of the time, but Dave Kaplan is in the range of players who I respect, where I'm like,
that means you have to that means you have to fire at him.
No, but I think that I have more than a 75% likelihood to win sideboarded games, even going second. I just didn't happen to win this one.
Right? But you're building that because you won't like, so let's say for the sake of argument, like I understand that you don't believe that Tempting Wurm's a square bet, and you shouldn't take any bets that you don't think give you equity, right? But let's just say for the sake of argument that Tempting Wurm is a very volatile bet. Like I'm saying that volatile. if you believe that it's a volatile bet, but it does have payoff, and if you respect Dave Kaplan in this way, then you should take that shot, because it's important.
Take that shot sometimes.
Well, I think that you should take the shot. Like again, because we can't blend it at this point, right?
At the point that I cast the Avamaya Elder, right? One of the known cards that Dave had was Stifle. Okay, I knew that he had a Stifle, and he had 4 open mana, and he probably had access to both an Impulse and a Flash of Insight, right? So I'm trying to piece this together. I didn't know that he had a Dreadnought yet. And knowing that he has a Stifle, he has 4 open mana, he has probably like 5 cards in hand. You just roll a Tempting Wurm die there?
Yeah, I'd ship it.
You just cast a Tempting Wurm.
Yeah, you just ship it.
Like I had already.
I mean, I would do some math. Well, I would do some math. So what is it for? Like you think it's 3 knowns, no unknowns?
But the problem is that like if he has Impulse and Flash of Insight, right?
Well, is the Flash of Insight in his graveyard?
No, I think it was in his hand. I don't know.
Then the Flash of Insight isn't a data point, right? So it's just Impulse.
Like it's. I don't know, man.
This is exactly what I'm illustrating, though, because it is actually this is like a good illustration. Like Yavimaya Elder is like 5 mana, draw a card and 2 lands, right? Like I don't ever want to exist in a universe where like I'm excited to do that, and you are stoked to do it. Like it kills me how excited you are to spend 5 mana to draw a card and 2 basic lands, and then afterwards like spend your time recurring nightmare, like looping the Yavimaya Elder to continually to put basic lands in your hand. Like the amount that you're excited to do it, just to me, it just can't be right. I don't even think that if you disagree with everything that I say across the board, I still think that you vastly overrate that kind of play, because like it's just not a good play. It's not a good play in context. Like, it's so difficult to even find a context where it's good. It's so difficult to find a context where it's good that, like, I don't think it should be in the deck.
Because it has a below average rate? Is that what the thing that you don't like about it?
I mean, that's thing number one. But the thing is, like, every other universe is super bad except for when your opponent is like has Goblin Piledriver. Like, well, then it's just actually, okay.
I hadn't even thought about that. So AI invented rate, right? So that's a Floresism.
Who cares if you suck at using it? Like, come on.
But that's fair. But the thing is that, like, I think that you think that I'm fixated on endpoints, and I think almost everybody else doesn't understand strategy. I'm playing Magic. I'm not playing fucking my cards against your cards. I have a whole thing in my head about how this game is going to go, and like 90% of the time, if you just play my game the way that I want, I'm going to win. That's how I've operated for many years, and it works out most of the time.
I mean,
like, one of the reasons I'm less good at contemporary Magic than in some other previous formats is the cards are so powerful you can't do that.
Mike, I think that, you know, good for you, but I also think that it's copium. Like,
well, I mean, obviously I'm going to say I don't think that.
Yeah,
it's copium, right?
like your image of yourself is way too strong. It always has been, and your scapegoating is also way too frequent, right? Like,
maybe
like this, like again, like I think that
what should I have said given the outcome of the match? I mean, like, okay, I screwed up in game one. I don't understand how that's scapegoating.
Well,
right?
one is just, if your technical play isn't there, right? Oh yeah, so this is actually kind of fine, right? So if your thesis is that you're not a good technical player and you're a good, like, strategic thinker, then I will accept that as the reason that you haven't hit the, you know, you didn't find the Holy Land, right? You didn't make it to the end zone.
I think that, like, I think that the biggest flaw in my game is I'm bad playing ahead. That, like, I'm actually very good playing behind. The problem was I was winning. So I was winning, and the next one I was still winning. I mean, and then I gave it up, and I gave it up.
That's a good example of a problem.
Literally,
right?
I would say that's the worst leak in my game, because I had executed the game the way that I wanted, and I'm now okay. All right, everything fired on my way, and it didn't. I was so far ahead in my imagination. Obviously, right? The BK had identified this in my game 20 years ago, right? Like, I could have just done this thing, and then I'm going to win the game like 90% of the time the next turn, right? Or, like, you know, in 3 turns or something. But I'm like, oh, I'm winning. He has to draw this, and then he has to draw this. But the problem was I didn't do the math.
Yeah. You being really bad at math is definitely not helping here, and that's why like when I talk about this, like, when I think that you are over-indexed on narrative, like over-indexed on emotion, like you believe too strongly in that. Like, part of that is because, like, you know, your ability to evaluate ranges just feels completely broken to me. Like, it just feels like it's not a functioning part of your brain. And it's really weird, because the one thing, like,
super weird. I'm a professional statistician.
the other
that's an odd.
I know it's an odd thing, but it happens, right? It's happening over the table. Your BK called it out on you 20 years ago, and according to your own words,
it occurred to me to use the stats there. That's
right. So if it doesn't occur to you to turn on, but and it's actually interesting, because the ways that you have sort of, like, and actually this is just, like, overall, right, which is, like, I think that you have a very strong intuition surrounding things. Like, it's the thing that makes Cabal Therapy a powerful card in your hands, right? But I totally believe that. I've seen it, right? Like, I think that obviously when I'm sitting there and you Cabal Therapy my Merchant Scroll, I'm just kind of like, how did he know? But I, you know, if I sit back and I think, and I did the whole, like, sit down and try to like think of all the cards to name, I think that it would be really hard to name Merchant Scroll if you're kind of talking things out, and it's a lot easier to name Intuition. Same thing with Mano and the Sleight of Hand, right? Like, there's just weird stuff like that. But like the thing is, like, your attachment to these narratives, like, never comes along with, like, a writer, like it never comes along with, like, a healthy dose of self-doubt, right? So a good example, I think, is the red green oath discussion, because, like, I don't really understand why you would have that discussion. Like, you sound like me sometimes, which is just like, you have Oath of Druids, you can't lose this game. Like, I've actually come around on that because a bunch of people have played this matchup not Black Green Survival versus Red Green Oath, but Terrageddon versus Red Green Oath, right? And so for the longest time, my basis of it was like pretty simple. One, I saw a tweet from one of the Magic Online grinders where he was like basically giving up on Terrageddon because he's like, there's no point in playing this deck if I have to run it into like the Oath version, you know, which is just going to crush me because I'm going to play Weathered Wayfarer and they're going to play Oath. And then the Terrageddon Cabal recently has basically come back and just be like, we actually have like a way to play this matchup that works, right? We have a functional way to play this matchup. And I don't see it because like what I see is like Oath of Druids is like just a super, super strong card against them. And like once you put it on the battlefield, it puts tremendous pressure on them. And when you talk about the Black Green like survival thing, it's like you've got Fran just like telling you like whatever, and you're just like, well, that doesn't work game one or that like whatever. And I'm just kind of like, well, I don't know. He played the matches, and even if like you land somewhere in the between, there's just no way it's 70-30. Like there's just like the burden of proof for you to demonstrate that it's 70-30 would necessarily have to go beyond just looking at deck lists, right? Like we do this when I say something like Burn beats goblins, right? I actually can't say a number until I play it, 5 times in a row.
I still don't know who's supposed to win that matchup. Problem is, I just don't know who's supposed to win that matchup. Problem is, I mostly win from both sides. The example I would give you is in, I think 1999, Carton Ken Kruner won a PTQ with an Ophidian deck in Extended. So he won he might have had like Giant Turtle or something, but his deck had Ophidian and Morphling as the end game. Or like, oh, this is the end for High Tide, right? Because like once you get Ophidian, it's like Ophidian, Thawing Glaciers, and the math problem from the High Tide side was they're never going to miss a land drop because they have Ophidian and Thawing Glaciers. You can't win. Then I did, and I looked at it, and I'm like 100% matchup from the High Tide side, and they're like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like 100%, not, and the prevailing wisdom is like 85% from the Ophidian side, right? It's like 100% from the High Tide side, can't possibly lose, and you're like, that is an insane number. I'm like, here's how it works. They have a limiting factor. The limiting factor is they can have 7 counterspells in their hand. And they won't have 7 counterspells in their hand because they always have to be playing a land, right? That's the entire thing they're discarding. The second they discard a counterspell, you win. And you're like, what are you talking about? You're just like, you sculpt your hand, right? They're attacking you for 0, okay? You have infinity turns here. You play the card Time Spiral in your deck. All you do is you wait until they have to discard the hand size. That's how this game is going to go. They either play a Morphling. If they play a Morphling, they're going to have compromised mana. They're not going to be able to cast all the counterspells they've been accumulating. They play a Morphling to actually kill you, or they discard a counterspell. At the point that they discard a counterspell, you have 8 must counter cards. 8 must counter cards is your goal. They have 7. They have a limiting factor of 7. That means I will cast 8 cards in my turn, and then they lose. 100% matchup. You think I have a fixation on endpoints, and maybe I do, but I figured that out, right? Like, there's the other situation, which is like your opponent has like 14 absorbs in their hand. How do you kill them with your red deck? I'm like, figured it out, right? Like you figure out what the opponent's limiting factor is, and like what were my identifying points? They have a finite amount of black mana and one way to interact with you. That's why I can't conceptualize this being a bad matchup, because it occurs to me that no one played it correctly. It's the same as the people who were like, oh, the Ophidian deck must have a 75% matchup against High Tide. Our evidence is that this has been played in these PTQs, and then the Ophidian players are beating the High Tide players, including taking first place in these long-term things. And then the counter argument is, except for none of them played right. And then by the end of the season, it was High Tide again. Like, do you see what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, I see what you're saying. I'm saying, but that's my point. Is like
an impossible math
my point is just that it's just like, I understand what you're saying, and you said it multiple times. I think that it's just a thesis until you can demonstrate it. Like, I think that you can't come out and say say this like it's a fact because you read the deck lists. Like you can say it's a theory, but it's just not a fact until like
So
you and don't get me wrong, like I'm like 100% on the train of people punt all of these matchups. All these matchups that people are struggling with, like I think
it's not even that they're punting it. They're just they're planned.
Mike.
Plan is wrong.
It's fine. It's fine. I'm using punting to include strategic inflexibility, right? Like this includes people who, you know, like it's very like we love that here on Spike Colony, right? Because we basically we love mill them, right? Like that's like
we love what?
Mill them. That's like the best endpoint analysis game in contemporary pre-modern that we've ever seen, right? Which is just that like this Mono Blue Dreadnought deck just doesn't do anything. It just counters 8 spells, maybe 12, and mills them, right? And and that's like an excellent example of that. And that evolved at some point. You can look at it two ways. Maybe David looked at the deck lists. Maybe David saw PSS coverage and saw Rich do it. Or maybe he played it a few times, tried a few different things. Maybe he booted a cockatrice and saw both sides. I'm saying that you've done none of that. You've just looked at the deck list. And Fran has done some of it. He's played the Red-Green Oath side. And the narrative for Fran's game, maybe Fran completely punted off. That's the part that you're effectively implying, right? Because your idea of this is that he could never lose. So the only way he could lose is if he punted or if he got flooded or whatever. God, imagine a 32 mana source deck getting flooded, but that's neither here nor there. And I'm just telling you that like you can't posit this theory like it's true until you can demonstrate it. Like, you know, because the counter, like you don't have great answers to the counterpoints. You don't have great answers for what happens if you don't draw Oath. You don't have great answers for what happens if they hold back Swamp.
You just cast the terror.
But that's the thing is like all of those start pulling the conversation away from what you've analyzed as this specific endpoint, right? So it's a fork in the road that basically says, like, I'm going to take you out of a universe in which both players have their entire deck in their hands and both players have this like full agency over what they're doing, right? And I'm going to pull you into an actual game where you actually have to manage resources. You're drawing X cards for turn. You might not see the Oath of Druids. You might not like have land destruction when they have mana sources. They might have more mana sources. And like, you know, just like when you bring a dose of reality into the situation, every single layer you get, you don't actually have to be right or wrong. It's just like your ability to predict outcomes becomes more complicated. So it's like very easy, right? When you look at two deck lists and you're just like, well, the most they can have is 7 counter spells, and then eventually you'll break through. Like it's like, don't get me wrong. I think it's very astute. To effectively understand that in Circle of Protection red situations, the burn player isn't going to lose, right? Like that the Circle of Protection player might actually just get decked, right? Different things. Like I think it's very, very sharp to analyze those things and understand them. But I also think you have to like acknowledge the shortcomings in that analysis. And I think that you're too in love with your conclusion. And like you don't bring any skepticism to these theories, because like I mean I don't even know why. Like it's like strange to me because I'm very similar to you, in which sometimes I look at things and I'm just like there's like, you know, it's like are people crazy? Like obviously this has to go whatever, but like I still like I don't know, like I still think that bringing some amount of skepticism to that is like the best thing that you can do, because it also just forces yourself to ask larger what ifs.
I don't know. Is your ultimate thesis that I'm too arrogant of a strategist?
1,000%, yes.
All right, maybe I'm too arrogant of a strategist. I think that,
but that's a leak. Like that hurts your ability to play. Like that hurts your ability to like advance.
So I'm not perfect, and I think that my
don't say it. No, none of that. The start of the sentence was a 0 out of 10. Start over.
Fine. I could. So maybe it'll make up for the second half of the sentence. So like I can only do, like anybody, I can only do so many things, but I choose this over this. I don't think that I can, like,
Why?
I can't have a bias towards two things that are in opposition to each other, right?
Why?
So
Why not?
I would have a bias towards certainty in matchups where I think I have the advantage. You think that if this is true, so John identified this. It's like John thinks that like one of his strengths is the ability to operate in a zone of uncertainty, right? I think part of it, like my leak in losing to Kaplan this morning, for example, is like, okay, I orchestrated this thing the way that
you blundered.
I wanted to. I got to the point where like I quote unquote won, air quotes, right? But then I didn't win because I'm bad at playing.
Yeah. You punted you punted 33% with a blunder, and you know, we can argue about 5 or 10% in one direction or the other with sideboarding. You erased any advantage that you could have had sideboarding by blundering.
I don't think that that's quite true. Like I should have won game 1, right?
Right, which is 33% of the games up to. It's actually
that was 50% in this case.
Yeah, and 50 right? In this case it's 50%, right? So it's 40, you know, 40%.
Yeah, so but then, you know, then my loss in game 2 was just a loss in the range. I was just a little unlucky. Right? And I don't think there was much I could have done. I know you don't think that. I think your sideboarding
strategy
is better. I literally tried multiple strategies.
Yeah, I know. And like that's my challenge to you, which is just to like, I don't know, fight against yourself harder, because I'm not always going to be there to do it. And like I don't really like part of the problem is that you seem to be satisfied to like, you know, sort of continue going along the lines that you are. And I actually like one of the things that the Spike Colony effectively gets accused of is telling people how to live their life. And
I'm not anybody how to live their life.
I'm not in the business of, well, again, that's why I said effectively. There's obviously complexities to it, but like, you know, my objective, and you know, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Like I learn tremendously because arguing with you helps me organize my thinking, right? I can see kind of what you're doing, and like by trying to crack open your thinking, it helps me crack open my thinking. Like, and the thing is, like, this is a sort of a pattern that we get into where basically you're the one with a lot of theses, and I'm the one who, you know, is essentially just like asking you why not at every turn. And, you know, I don't think that you give satisfying answers during that process. And I don't think that you ask yourself why not, like, often enough through that process. And, you know, ironically, you know, I could very easily suffer from the same leak, and I could very easily suffer from the same, you know, same thing at every turn, which is just like, I want to fit something into, like, I want to fit something like with our, you know, long black-green discussion. I'm basically fitting it into, you know, the same kind of heuristic and narrative, which is just that, like, you're saying that you can ensure inevitability, and I'm basically saying that the mono blue player can ensure inevitability, and both can't be true.
So I think there's a thing where we have a divide, and I think that one of the best leaps in my game where I got better, right? Where I got better was about, it's probably like almost 20 years ago at this point, right? So Osip was watching me. I've had a really good deck, and then I lost in top 8 playing for a slot, right? I was playing this deck that, like, Chapin had some ideas and Andrew Koenig had some ideas, and I made this Mishra deck that was really awesome, and I screwed up playing for one of my endpoints, just like what you're imagining, right? Just like classic, I didn't play to the table, right?
Yeah.
And Osip looked at and I'm like, well, this was my plan. He's just like, your problem is you play too much for your deck helping you, right? Like, and you don't take the wins that are on the table because you think that there's a win waiting for you, right? And so I completely, I mean, I guess I have a fixation on endpoints.
Guess you still have that, right? Because you'll do the same kind of blunder.
But I stopped playing for the top of my. One thing I did is I stopped playing for the top of my deck, right? Like, I'm way better at playing the game that at hand after that versus just playing for the game of the future. And the game moves, so I had to anyway, because like all this stuff in contemporary Magic is so immediate now, right? So back then there was a lot of building.
We can't.
Let me finish my point on this one, right? Like, I think that, like, maybe some of it's like you're just like, oh well, you have intuition about this or something, right? But I think that you have this idea of trying to win games that you have to get lucky. And my fundamental idea is I want to win as many games as possible when everything goes wrong for me, right? But a lot of the stuff that you're saying that you think that I have like a bad response to is, and in my head I'm like, 3 things had to go right for me for this to even be in the universe we're talking about, right? I'm winning these games while my opponent has a better draw, while I'm stumbling on mana, etc. And you want me to plan for a game where 3 things went right for me. That's the reason those cards aren't in my deck, right? Like, I don't want to plan for that. I want to plan to win these games that, like, a bunch of, like, that's how I want. I mean, I didn't win game 2, but I literally juked Kaplan into exposing a Dreadnought he couldn't protect by sequencing my mana in a certain way. He's like, oh, I can't believe you did that. I'm like, right? You know, I go swamp.
Yeah, you go, then you lose. Like,
well, I lost 20 turns later. Right?
Yeah, but
I went swamp nothing. He's
but
just
that's
like,
the thing is,
blood.
like, these,
he's like combo. I'm like forest naturalized.
You can. I have 2 things to that. One is that you don't necessarily have to. Believe in what you believe and still not, adopt my plans, right? Because your assessment of my plans, like, at a baseline, is super colored by emotion, and I don't blame you for it. Like, if I was in your situation, maybe if I had the cards in my hand and I cast those Tempting Wurms, maybe my reaction would be exactly the same. Like, maybe I would just be like, oh, I have quickly discerned that Tempting Wurm is not something that I want to do in the matchup. I think that's completely plausible. We actually have to pull. Do you remember what Phil? I mean, we have like a 3-way divergent strategy where,
well, obviously, if I had Hypnotic Spectre in my sideboard, I would have sided it in, right? Like, that's just not a card I had.
I understand. Like, that's not what I'm talking about, though, because Phil's boarding out Wall of Roots, which is something that you're fundamentally against.
Yeah. So the problem that I have with that is this deck is very bad at getting out of stage 1 unless it has a catalyst. So you can't even play your baseline game plan unless you get lucky. That's the problem that I have with it. It's a 20 land deck. If X, Y, and Z don't go right, you don't cast any spells. Well,
Phil's plan kind of, for the listeners, Phil is minus Masticore, minus Baloth, minus 2 Hermit, minus Bone Shredder, minus Withered Wretch, minus 3 Wall of Roots, plus Naturalize, plus Hypnotic, plus Mesmeric Fiend, plus 2 Tempting Wurm, plus 1 Faceless. So the differences here is that Phil doesn't have the 3rd Tempting Wurm. Instead, he has a Hippie. He has a Mesmeric Fiend instead of something else. I guess he has a Mesmeric Fiend. No, he has Faceless.
I would have been happy to play Mesmeric Fiend if it were on the sideboard.
So Phil is actually pretty straightforward, where he's just cutting out some Wall of Roots, and he's also cutting out the most expensive cards from his deck. And he is very in on Tempting Wurm. He'll have 3 after sideboarding, and with no acceleration, it definitely looks like it's the plan. So I think that I wouldn't take out all of the deranged. At most, I would take out 1, but I like having them all because from the Dreadnought side, deranged is just another thing that you have to do something about.
If you get deranged Hermit, it absorbs a great deal of a Dreadnought, so you can be in a situation.
Yeah, but the reason I like it is because it wins the game if they don't have Dreadnought. Like, it does both, right? It plays offense and defense.
Dude, they can daze it and they can stifle it. It's like so bad.
Yeah,
I mean, like I keep one of them. It is pretty
they're
bad.
They're not gonna have days after sideboard.
I mean, I don't know. I don't think Kaplan had days after sideboard, but I'm saying they could. Some people might.
Yeah,
right?
but
you don't know.
Then you're trying to multiply. Like then their days. Then you can just simply, like, if you have a read on days, right? You can simply just have 1 more mana. But again, I'm keeping.
I think that it is. I'm keeping
deranged and I'm keeping mana. I think it's actually very, it's very straightforward that when you board out mana sources, you are playing a tricky game. But he is basically saying that he's going to make his deck lean. I mean, his his sideboarding is like all in on Raska's theory. So I think he's probably closer. Well, he's certainly closer to me than he is to you, but he at least keeps in Recurring Nightmare. So he sees that as a key part of his deck. I think the mana sources thing is actually totally fine. It's basically matching the density of the Dreadnought deck. Like you can't be 28 air against Dreadnought.
So the advantages that the Dreadnought deck has in game 1 is that it wins all the fast games, like all the games that are decided.
You've mentioned this.
But the second thing is it wins almost all the games where people are peeling, right? Because it can assemble the combo and kill you in a short enough window that that changes in the sideboarded games.
Well, okay. My overall problem
games, you attack them on multiple zones at the like simultaneously.
Right, you have naturalize. We agree that you have naturalize. The thing that I'm just like overall confused by is just that like like you have this like, oh, they'll win the early game, right? If they go jam, they win. Of course. And then you have this thing where like I win the late game. I'm going to have Recurring Nightmare loops, and they're never going to be able to make the same amount of card advantage that I can.
Recurring Nightmare is just a card that generates resources. Like
you have
a deck has way more resources than
the
blue deck after
my fundamental thesis is that survival is enough, and you only need survival to lock up your end game, so you can free up everything else to be concerned with the third kind of game, which is just before Dreadnought has zero, before both players have 0 cards in hand or whatever nonsense, but sometime after the window has passed on their ability to just like full shove, you can play a game like on turn 5 that's just like maybe a couple discard spells and a Tempting Wurm, if you don't have Survival of the Fittest, or maybe navigate to the same situation that you had where Dave ships the Dreadnought, you have duress naturalize, he says I can't believe you do that, and then your follow-up is Tempting Wurm. Like those are the games that I would be like most interested in, because those are the ones that look very similar to the kind of Dreadnought games that I played. Like when I played the finals against Goblins, fundamentally we were playing a game where my opponent didn't find offense after dealing with my first Dreadnought in games 2 and 3. I need to check the recap on game 2, but I won games 2 and 3, right? And I think in both of those games I didn't fully protect my Dreadnought. So like what happened afterwards was I was able to put it together. And like that's why I think offense is so important, because like I think that Dreadnought finds cards much faster than you do. And so maybe your ability to lock stuff up totally matters, but like I think that trading on time isn't a solid strategy, because I think that Dreadnought thrives from being able to have time. And a big reason why it has that is just because it has Flash of Insight. And so like it has Gush, obviously.
That is the case in other. It depends. Did Dreadnought answer all of my spikes?
Yeah. It depends. But my whole point is that this is just a part that's not part of the analysis that you lose in the first 5 turns, and not part of the analysis that you win in the final 20. Like that's just like all I am. It's like there's just a third type of game where it's just mid range, like where it's just like what cards you have now need to line up with what cards they have now. And Recurring Nightmare doesn't line up against anything. It doesn't force your opponent to do anything. Like your opponent gets to choose like, oh, I can counterspell this or I cannot, and they can make the decision that's like best for them. And like that's actually a huge thing. That's a huge difference. One of the biggest like decision points in Mono Blue Dreadnought versus Goblins is like letting Goblin Warchief resolve, right? Because Goblin Warchief makes it impossible for you to like, close every door, because now you're protecting against Naturalize or Pyroblast and whatever, but you also have to protect against your opponent just putting offense on the battlefield. But like is
there an argument for letting Goblin Warchief not be like, if you already have a Dreadnought and you have him on a 2-turn clock?
No, not if you already have a Dreadnought, just like if they can get Warchief on the battlefield. If you have a Dreadnought, then math is really simple, and so long as you don't punt your combat math, you should be able to like.
My baseline would be to stop at Warchief. I think it's like the main.
Right, but you actually are forced to make a read, right? Because if their hand is Warchief but not enough aggression and just answer cards, then it's better for you to let it resolve and fight over the answer cards. Like if your opponent's hand, if you have one counterspell and your opponent's hand is Warchief Naturalize versus Warchief Piledriver, you know, those are like big questions that you can ask yourself. Obviously, it's more complicated because you would just counter the Piledriver if it's an existential threat. But you know, you have a finite, like it basically turns goblins into answer spells, you know, in a manner of speaking. But it also just shortens your clock. So you're essentially in a point where you can be like, I'm gonna have it in 3 turns, or I'm going to be down. I'm going to have traded a resource and I might not have it in 3 turns. And then, you know, I'll get eaten.
This is actually pretty interesting. This is like a very parallel matchup, right? Where like, if you have a Dreadnought, if you have the initiative, you only need to play for 2 more turns,
Yes.
right? So you just prevent them from doing anything in the next 2 turns. But if it's a game about resources, then you're increasingly bad, right? Like that's the,
I mean, if you never ask a question like Goblin Warchief, like if you never put the Dreadnought player in a very difficult spot where they have to be like, okay, like now I have to choose what I'm doing with my cantrips. Now I have to find Dreadnought because, you know, the runway for me to sculpt a perfect hand is finite. Like if you do that, like your ability to ask those questions, like is really important. And that's what I said from the beginning. It's like you just took all the teeth out. You made yourself a pile of removal or a pile of answers and a card advantage engine. And I'm just telling you, it's like it's not enough in a lot of games. And it might be the case that you tested it and it actually is enough. And I'm kind of fine with that because I was, you know, your idea, which is just that like this deck isn't like the other removal decks, right? It isn't like Landstill because it can't get tided out and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like I'm actually so okay with that because, you know, that's reasonable to me. And I think it's totally reasonable for you to be like, to adopt that game plan. My like idea was that you could adopt that game plan and you wouldn't be giving up that much by also having like Tempting Wurm give you the option to play the ultra grind late game and play like the mid game, where you're able to get a Goblin Warchief like question onto the battlefield at a time that's inconvenient for your opponent.
I think that this is kind of my ultimate thesis on Tempting Wurm and like having one Tempting Wurm in the deck, right? When I was playing it. And I explained this to Rebel and she thought this was actually a very, very good explanation. I think it might be an even better explanation for you, right? So Tempting Wurm is a card that makes this deck into a Marvel Snap deck. It transforms it from a Magic deck into a Marvel Snap deck. You know, there's like random cards in Marvel Snap decks, like an Ebony Maw, right? You're just like, oh, this is just a 1 mana to one energy to 7 power conversion, and sometimes you get it with War Machine or whatever. Just because the game is the only expression in the game is how much power you put in locations. And then you have a limiting factor of a static limiting factor of how much energy you have. Tempting Wurm is a non-synergistic card that gives you a dimension of just putting power in the battlefield. But it is important to understand that it is not synergistic. It is situationally quite bad a lot of the time. I think that you're like,
I mean, you're saying by a lot of the time you're implying 51%, right? Like, what are you implying percentage-wise?
I think that it is, if the credit card game were not a fair bet, I think that's what Tempting Wurm is. So the credit card game is a fair bet.
I'm sensitive to that, and you've made that point. I think again, like it sounds like it's totally fine. Like your needle isn't moving on like, you know, on what kind of bet it is, and that's again like it makes sense to me that you would take that line, and I just think that. You know, I just think that that's pretty short-sighted. And I think that, you know, again, we've kind of zoomed in and out like 1,000 times.
So I had a game against Goblins where I whiffed on a Cabal Therapy on turn 2 or turn 3, and he had nothing, right? He just has lands, and he had a first turn Lackey, but his follow-up was only Mog Fanatic. I literally like Siege Gang Commander. This is nothing good. I'm like, Tempting Wurm got that game. So I'm so excited because Tempting Wurm got that game. I sided my other Tempting Wurms because in my head, this is a bad translation, but I'm like, I remember Kaplan being so good with Tempting Wurm against my red deck, right? But now he's against Goblins. This game on turn 2, he reveals to me with Goblin Ringleader, 2 more Goblin Ringleaders, and I'm looking at the Tempting Worms in my hand, and I'm like, wow, I cannot play this card ever. And it was just super opportunistic that the one Tempting Worm happened to come up when he had only
This
lands.
is the worst example ever because
Why?
Because you don't play Tempting Worm against goblins.
It was in my main deck.
Yeah, but you kept you're saying it happened to you in game 2. You said you did it in the first game.
No, I was so excited because the Tempting Worm was so good with my discard in game.
Yeah,
but
that's
I thought this would be good.
That's just another leak. That's just like you not assessing. Like somehow, like you've made the wrong conclusion in both directions. You like basically when it's good when it shouldn't be, you're like it's good, and then when it's bad when it should be good, you're like saying that it's bad. Like you're just responding, like. And then I can't. I really can't. Like it says here that we're doing -3 duress, 1 vigilante, 1 withered wretch for 4 engineered plague plus 1 bone shredder against goblins. So it does mean that you could randomly have the Tempting Worm, Tempting Worm on turn 2 in game 2, but I would never cast it on turn 2. Like
I only casted it because I saw that he only had lands.
No, that was in game 1.
Yeah, but then it was in my
So
deck.
then you did it in game 2 on turn 2.
I didn't do it in game 2. He revealed.
Okay, that's fine. Whatever.
I didn't cast it.
That's fine. I would board out the singleton if it was me.
I couldn't. There's no way to board everything out. I actually had Withered Wretch in my deck.
Withered Wretch is better than Tempting Worm in this context.
Yeah, but I couldn't get all the Tempting Worms out. It was not possible. There's not enough cards.
It's okay to have greater than 0 duress. I certainly wouldn't have 4, right?
No.
But you're just bringing in.
What card does duress good against? Naturalize?
Yeah, just naturalize. But you come up to 8 enchantments, right? So your angle is going to be like duress, engineered plague, survival. It's a much bigger argument to duress to protect both survival and engineered plague than it is to just protect engineered plague there. But even then, you could just go. You could just board out 3 duress and a Tempting Worm for 4 plague. What's so bad about that? You can board in the the faceless butcher instead of the Tempting Worm.
I cited in the faceless butcher the
So what's so hard about sideboarding? 4 plague and a butcher for 4 duress and Tempting Worm, and then if you want to board out Tabby. If you want to board out,
Tabby's pretty bad.
Yeah, if you want to board out Tabby, then if you want to board out Tabby, then you leave a duress.
Vigilante.
Oh no, there's a bone shredder.
These are cards that you would rather have.
Yeah, there's a bone shredder here too. So it's 6 in, and then you board out 3 duress, a Tempting Worm, a Tabby, and Vigilante.
I think that I would rather have 1 Tempting Worm than any number of duress.
Oh yeah, well that's fine too.
I think duress is just pretty bad.
I mean, that's fine too. I don't think it's that bad to have one duress by 8 enchantments that your opponent wants to stop, but
you kind of have to cast it before you cast any enchantments, and there's one it's floating in your deck
but you have
somewhere.
8.
It's super bad.
You have 8. You have 8 by 1, so you're only drawing the 1 whatever 5% of the time, and then you have the 8 80% of the time.
They're just always going to have a naturalize to preempt your duress unless you cast it first, which is super impossible to predict.
Right,
especially if you have 1.
But that's the thing is you're basically saying if Tempting Worm is just as bad in situations where they have random ringleader or whatever, then there's plenty of reason to address. It's value over replacement.
I'm saying sometimes I'll hit with a Tempting Worm and it will be good, like it was in game 1.
Sometimes you'll hit with duress and it'll be good.
But why? If it's in my opening hand and they have a naturalize, that's
if it's in your opening hand, or if you draw if it's in your opening range, and if it's not, we're basically not having a conversation.
But I have to draw the 1 of in my opening hand before I cast any enchantments, or it's also very unlikely to hit.
Yeah, I mean, well, you also might not draw it, but that's the point, is that when you do draw it, you'll probably have
No, when I do draw it, it will never hit because they will have naturalized before I draw it. That's the reason.
Right, but at that point,
bad.
I mean, at that point, you probably have it, and then you have it behind the rest of your game, right? Then
no,
I get what you're saying.
Hits.
Drawing duress, right, is not a good not a good thing late game, and fundamentally, I think that it's okay to have 1 of something. It's it's kind of like playing 1 days. You're actually sort of more
not
likely.
At all like playing 1 day.
It's actually
always has text.
Mike, it's actually interesting because assuming that your cards are going to come in certain order, right? We live in one universe where it's in your opening hand, ahead of an enchantment. That's good. Then we have
And they
another.
have to have
Then we have
naturalize.
another universe where it's not in your opening hand and it's not ahead of an enchantment. That's bad. But most of the time, because their naturalize doesn't have any targets, it just sits in their hand. So all you have to do is draw it before your enchantment at any point in time, right? So you just have the duress. Like, you're going to be able to pick off the naturalize if you have an engineered plague or a survival of the fittest coming. I don't actually think it's that bad.
So
because they have no targets. So your duress is almost always going to pick up.
My default setting is I'm going to cast Engineered Plague as soon as I can that it's generating value, right? I'm not just going to play
my thesis isn't to wait for your one of duress with enchantments.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is it's just bad the overwhelming percentage of the time. Like I can only think of, like, strategically, I can only think of one quadrant in the XY that I would ever want it. And then it's actually only half of the XY. Right, because they also have to have the naturalize. So the problem is, are they going to have 4 naturalize after sideboarding? Maybe, probably. I don't know.
I think that they should against a black deck, knowing that engineered plague is really bad for them.
That has a survival and recurring nightmare. Sometimes you'll play a recurring nightmare. I don't know, right? Like but will they have it in their opening hand? I don't know. Right, like they don't have it in their opening hand the majority of times in the abstract, but maybe they mulligan to it. Right, I always lose a Engineered Plague, so I mulligan to naturalize. I don't know. That seems kind of terrible, right? But like, the only quadrant where this is good is it's in my opening hand, or like it's before an enchantment is probably in my opening hand. Right? Like, if I only have one, the likelihood of that happening is low. So most of the time, and I mean really most of the time, right? Like 90% of the time, it's in a bad quadrant insofar that it either misses or actually just it misses because they don't have it, or they misses because they get to respond to it. In my imagination, Tempting Wurm is better than 90% bad, right? There are many situations where
I obviously don't have 90% bad. I think it's actually pretty simple. It's just like, if you draw it, it is likely to be nearest. Like, there's likely to be an enchantment behind it somewhere in your deck, like in the next top 5, like at actually a pretty reasonable rate. Because all that has to happen is that you draw it for an enchantment. They have naturalizes sitting in their hand. You'll have a duress sometime. Like, most of the time, you're just not going to draw it. It's not a big deal, right? So, like, a huge quadrant is just like not drawn, whatever. Your enchantments are so important that it's actually okay to, like, draw a blank or draw a duress that might miss if you resolve the enchantment. And given that you have 8 enchantments somewhere in your deck, the one duress is going to be in front, within 5 cards in front, like at actually a reasonable point in time. But your opponent's just going to be sitting there with the naturalized. They'll have drawn it. They'll have drawn one of their 4 a lot of the time. I don't
understand how it is both in front of an enchantment and ever hits. That's what I don't understand. Like,
because
even in the situation
in your opponent's
describing, they just cast the naturalized in response.
No, but I'm saying it's in front of enchantment, not behind, right?
But it's in front of all my enchantments?
It's in front of an enchantment. It doesn't matter. Like, you just have to ever draw it in front, and they just have to ever, like, have the naturalized, right? If they don't, the bust scenario for me is actually pretty simple. It's just that they've emptied their hand and they've played out all these goblins, and they've won the game because they had because you started on random stuff, enchantment, and then they had naturalized lots of goblins, and your only way to recover is to put a Tempting Wurm on the battlefield, and then you slap the top of your deck, you pick up the card, and it's a duress, and then you're like, curses, I needed a Tempting Wurm so I could stabilize the board. That actually sounds super reasonable to me, because there is, in most cases, goblins is going to have an empty hand.
So I agree with you that it will be, there's one copy in my deck, it's likely to be in front of some enchantment. Right before
near some enchantment, like
near or for sure. I agree with you. I don't understand how it ever hits, because it's also behind any number of enchantments before that point. Why did the naturalized not get cast already? That's what I don't understand. If I have a survival that's relevant, or an engineered plague that they need to answer to win anyway, why is it still in their hand when I draw?
Yeah. It might not be. But the thing is,
that's why it's 90. It's
right. But their range is 4 to 6, so it's plausible that they have duplicates. And I'm just saying it's a card that's waiting for a target, right? So because the naturalized is waiting for a target, the duress is also waiting for, like, the duress is also sitting waiting. So you're absolutely right that again, that's why I described the scenario, which is just that they naturalized your thing and then they unloaded on the board and then you lost because you top decked Duress instead of Tempting Wurm. I think that's totally fine.
But this is also the opposite kind of matchup than we spent most of the podcast talking about. They're constantly, if they're operating at all, they're putting pressure on me. They're like putting down one drops.
I think
tapping my mana with Rishadon Port. They're attacking with Goblin War Chief.
I think I'm down for one Tempting Wurm over one Duress. Just because it can block, and none of your creatures actually have power, so you can't block with almost anything else.
Well, it's not just that. It's that, like, if I draw the key enchantments, I pretty much play them as soon as I draw them. I can't sit there.
I'm not advocating for you to not cast your enchantments. I never did at any point. Like,
yeah, but if I cast my enchantments,
I know. Like, I know. I hear you. I told you that I'm okay. Like I hear, like, that's totally fine. That makes up a large percentage. I think that you're missing if they draw multiple naturalize, whatever, and like the balance between the opportunity costs. But as we talk it out further, I do think it's a large enough range. I mean, granted, Phil is just doing -3 Duress, minus Vigilante, minus Withered Wretch, and he's keeping in, I guess, a tabby, unless he has the tabby on the sideboard. Why
would you keep a tabby? It seems terrible.
I mean, he might not have the same. He might not have the same starting. He might not have the same starting 60 as you.
Okay.
He might just not have the tabby in the 60. I think he does, but I can't read all this at the same time. Let's see.
He has the second Tempting Wurm in his main deck now, I heard.
Yeah, I mean, I think he does have the tabby. Yeah, so he just keeps a Gray Ogre.
Is that better than a Withered Wretch? Costs 2 versus 3.
It's probably you never have BB.
One of the things that's bad.
I mean, he has both. He has both, so it doesn't matter.
One of the things that's bad about this, like we didn't talk about, is that
he does.
It has a very wide set of fail states because it just can't cast its spells. It's like if you're used to playing,
we don't have to talk about it. We don't have to
talk
talk about that. It's just a black green deck in pre-modern.
I think that's part of it.
Table stakes.
But I just think, like, when you're talking about, like, oh, here's all the things you do, like, you have to get past this zone of the game where you can cast your spells, and I think you're just not respecting that enough.
I mean, look, I respect people who are hoisting trophies at the end of the day, whether or not, like, it's possible that they're blundering or their opponent's blundering. Like, at the end of the day, like, all of the strategy, all of the theory, like all of like the ideas and that stuff, like it just has to be backed up with standing on top of the podium. Like it just has to. Like,
well, this is not a deck that can win lobby.
It's a huge balance, and like, at the end of the day, well, but the thing is, Phil is like absolutely crushing. Like his consistency playing online is extraordinarily high. It is rivaled by very, very few other people. And at some point, like, yes, his opponents might be blundering into him, but the other thing is, like, the two biggest opponents of him would be Paul Master and Fur, and up until recently, they just haven't been able to scratch him. And like, that's the thing, is like, Mike, I think we made the resume joke about you from the very beginning of the podcast, like. You can't really throw your resume around, and you can't, it's easier for me, right? If Javier wants to say contemporary Magic is taking away my edge, right? The way that the cards are designed now, makes it harder for me to win than they were in the past. Like, I'd be more inclined to believe him, but you just can't chalk up all of your L column to like everything outside of strategy. Like, I think that you think that your strategy is completely unimpeachable and is like completely bulletproof. Like, it's just this thing that you have. It's just like your secret. And I think that it's just not. Like, I think that it's still like I would be forced to take a hard look at everything, right? Because at the end of the day, you just have to stand on top. Like, that's all that matters.
I don't know. I think my window as a world-class player was pretty narrow, right? That was maybe 1 year. But out of 20, like 30 years or whatever.
I mean, you told me you think that you could top 8 the Pro Tour, and I think I could top. But but that's just not true.
Whether that doesn't mean
it's just not true. Just because you can watch the stream and point out misplays of pro players doesn't mean that you can be one.
I don't know. I think it is. I think that there are nearby universes where I could top 8 the Pro Tour.
Not this one. Not this one. Like that's what I'm saying about arrogance and hubris. It's just like, what, on what grounds?
I mean, like, I know a lot of people who've top 8'd Pro Tours, right? And I mean, some of them are much better than I am, but not all of them, right? Like,
that's the thing, is like, that is the definition of hubris. Like, you literally, like, this is why I was begging you to stop playing contemporary, because I was just like, there's just no point, right? Like, you're not grinding hard enough, and like
I'm not grinding hard.
You're super miserable. Like, you're flying back from these day ones, and you're just like, it's just like, it's hard to watch, And then you don't win the consolation thing too. Like, here's what I think. I think that.
I mean, I missed day 2 by 1 match.
I love. Don't. Do you hear yourself right now? Is that the logic of a champion? Like, well, I don't know. I don't know.
In these tournaments that are 22 rounds long, you have to have a lot of N. That's the thing. You could have an 85%
yeah,
win rate.
I know. But the thing is, you're not even putting that in. So what's the point? 32. I mean, you're not even putting that in.
You're right. I mean, I don't put in enough N.
Yeah.
Like, but that's why I think that. The thing that I think, right? Like, you have to have some amount of luck. You have to have some amount of volatility and explosiveness.
Nobody denies that, right? And
like, why not me? That's my whole theory.
Right, but why? That is literally the fishiest possible sentence in the history of the world.
I'm certainly good enough to be. I don't think I'm as good as Mr. Checklist, right? I don't think that I'm as good as Dominguez.
Order of magnitude. By an order of magnitude.
Not even close. Don't get me wrong, not even close, right? But I think that I'm good enough that I can catch an explosion, right? That's
the fish mentality. That's like the fishiest thing, is that you can nut draw. Like that you're just gonna be standing on top because you hit enough rivers. Like, come on.
I've had good enough records on the Pro Tour more than once.
I'm not.
We're better back.
I want you to know that, like, I feel horrible saying it because I think it's super mean, but I also think you really need to be brought down to reality with your self-assessment. I really don't know what's going on. Like, I don't know why you're so stubborn about it. Like I don't think that it's like a symptom of, like, somebody who has a successful process, right? Like, I think that you just need, like, you need to revamp your, like, you need to take stock of your process. And, like, I think that the things that I say, I just don't think that they're symptoms of like successful mindset. And, like, who am I to talk, right? Because, like, who's I don't know that I have successful mindset, right? But, like, I just don't, like, when I talk to you, I'm just kind of like, okay, well, like, I don't know why you're not asking yourself these questions.
I told you, there were 2 things I could have done better in my last round match.
Right, but that's
thought
not
about it afterwards.
That's, like, completely missing the point, right? You should ask yourself about everything. You should ask yourself about, like, I mean,
no one can ask themselves about everything, Lynn.
Mike, no one can, but they should strive to. Like, you don't help yourself by, like, narrowing everything down to, like.
I super disagree with you. I think that people should try to have the most utility, happiest life that they can. That's what I think. I think that if you fixate on things over which you have no control, that you're not.
That's not what I'm telling you to do. I'm telling you to fixate on the things that you can control. I'm telling you to fixate on the fact that, like, you have, like, you're just, like, you have such a, like, it's, I think what hurts is just, like, you have such a romantic view and, like, such a rose colored view of some of these, like, concepts and ideas. And I'm dying. Mano's screaming at the podcast right now, just, like, bring you back to earth. I'm sure anybody who knows you knows this, right? It's just like, they're just like, like, anytime there's, like, kind of this self-doubt, you really do latch on to your absolute moments of brilliance, right? I think that you've done things in Magic that are great accomplishments, like, that you should absolutely be proud of, that you should absolutely template things under, like, to take and be like, this was a successful thing that I did, and I'm going to continue pressing on that because that's my advantage. I have no problem with that, but don't do it so much that, like, you're not exploring other ways to think about things. You're not exploring the what ifs. You're not asking yourselves questions, about other things. Like, it's just like, I really do think it's just like, it's just too arrogant and it's like too confident. And it was like, I don't know. We're at the point where your end's not even large enough in pre-modern. Like, that's the other problem. And like, it's, and that's fine. It's kind of like, it makes it really hard to have this discussion though, right? Because it's just kind of like, we're sitting there. This is kind of the, this kind of goes all the way full circle to sort of the problem with having a pre-modern podcast, because like other people do contemporary, Magic podcasts because they're playing 500 matches of standard. Like,
but are they interesting personalities?
There's two elements, right? One of them is that they're providing like strategic utility to their listeners, right? So like, for instance, Dom has a podcast. I haven't listened to it very much, but Dom's on the tour, and he hit pay dirt, right? So we talked to him and we were like, well, how does it feel? And he was just like, my favorite thing about it, like the important part about it, the part that I value is just that I'm doing the right things. Like, it just validated that I'm doing the right things. You can do the right things and you can not top 8 the Pro Tour, but it certainly helps your case that you're doing the right things if you top 8 the Pro Tour. With pre-modern, we can joke and be like, ha ha ha, like, X person top 8'd LobsterCon, like, I won the side event, we won meetup, like, we play test matches, but it's just kind of like, it just pales in comparison, right? Because like, there's no way for us to possibly.
Pre-modern is not as important as the Pro Tour. I don't know what point you're making.
The point I'm making is that, like, is that we're in sort of a spot where, like, even if we did have a little bit more strength and a little bit more data to back up our claims, it wouldn't be sufficient data, right? And so like the Spike Colony thing has just always been vibes.
According to Mano and Flint, we like ruined pre-modern though.
Well, I mean, that's just their opinion. I think that part of us doing a disservice to the community would be to go a little bit too hard into some of our untested theories. Now, some of them, like, I think it's important to test, and that's why, like, I think that the Goblins versus Burn stuff was just like very, very beneficial to, at least illustrating my point. It doesn't have to be like a data driven thing. It just illustrates my point. Like, part of the problem is that I don't think that you ever illustrate the point, because you kind of just don't play these matches enough against, like, whatever. And like, here's the other thing. Here's the other thing.
Like,
Andy,
thought that I wouldn't be a very good podcast.
Andy's an excellent playtest partner, right? But like, we can't prove to our audience that Andy wasn't blundering from the Dreadnought side. Like, you're like, oh, I won all the sideboard games.
Oh yeah, testing. My credibility or whatever is I trust Andy's play, whereas I don't trust a bunch of the play that I watch when I watch streaming.
But there's nothing we can do to like demonstrate that to others.
Yeah,
and the other thing is we can't.
Andy won the JSS. I don't know. He's very good.
I know.
As far as I can tell.
Well, I mean, he top 8'd LobsterCon. Like, that's definitely important.
Yeah,
he top 8'd with the Tide deck, but it's like. But the thing is,
his
like, that
strategic mind is excellent.
That just forces us to just be in a place where we really, really can't afford any amount of arrogance and hubris beyond, like, farther than we could get thrown.
I don't even know what point you're making. Of course we can. We have a podcast. If people don't like the amount of arrogance and hubris,
well, I don't like it. I'm telling you that I don't like it. I think that you're way too arrogant about some of this stuff. And the thing is, like, it's hard. It's hard to have the circular conversation, and just like, not. I just feel like I'm not getting through to you, which is just like also part of the challenge.
So from my standpoint, like, you're just like declaring that I shouldn't have Recurring Nightmare and that these cards are better. And I'm telling you, I actually tested it. This was working really well for me. And you just won't accept that.
Yeah.
And then you're just, you're saying you're fixated on endpoints. I'm like, I actually think that I'm way less arrogant in this situation. I took the time to test the matchup.
Yeah, no, right? I mean, and that's like, totally fine.
And you're just like, you're just wrong. I'm like,
no.
That's the thing that happened.
I'm accepting of that, and that's actually the part that I'm struggling with, because I'm just kind of like, okay, well, now I've got to play.
I'm not even the bad guy this time.
I have to play this stupid deck and prove you wrong.
I will literally money match you against Ratson's deck with my strategy.
It'll just be like someone. I mean. But the thing is, we'd have to take odds, because apparently if you're winning.
No. You think that Rascal's deck can't be grinded. Why do we have to take odds?
What? No, I mean, I would rather play my sideboard strategy against Rascal's deck, because that's what I want to prove. I do think that the black green is overall favored in the matchup with a multitude of sideboarding plans. I think that mine's best.
I don't
So
know.
we'd have to do 10 matches of each sideboard against the Nebraska
I had
sideboard.
this spot I was planning to play in a standard RCQ that I ended up not playing for a number of reasons. One of which was it would qualify me for a modern RC, and I'm like, I just have no interest, right? So, but the thing that I was like, oh, I'm probably going to play red white, and so the thing that I tried to do was I played 5 leagues with different red white builds to try to determine which was the optimal version of red white to play in the RCQ before I found out that it was feeding a modern RC. And the problem that I had was I won all 5 leagues. So
every single time you say you're playing standard leagues on Arena, I'm just kind of like, why are you still doing that?
What are the things that I should do? Right? I'm not going to like, who am I even going to grind with? Right? Like, what are the tools at hand?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, what's the point then? Like,
I feel like, so this is different than playing for the Pro Tour, right? Like if I really cared about winning the Pro Tour and like this was the most important thing to me, then I would probably like take off my life and get Pro Tour houses and stuff. But that's not the universe that I live in. I just want to participate in the way that I can. Yeah,
I mean that's okay. Like but right? You run into the exact problem, right? It's just like you're testing against fish, so that you can never you can't learn. Like, of course you can beat fish. Like that's kind of
but the thing that I'm trying to say is like one of the things that could be a problem for me is like my mana doesn't come out, right? So I'm like,
I'm
what are the things that are operable and not?
Yeah, we can skip through that. Like that's obviously if you have a non-functioning deck, you'll find a way to lose to fish, right? But once you get to the point where you don't lose to fish, then there's nowhere for you to improve. You can't get any higher. It's the stupid blue-black ring deck in Modern, right? It was just like, oh, this deck had blue cards and I'm a better player than my opponent. It's just like, so I just always win, right? It's like, it didn't teach me anything because once my opponent actually figures out how to play, like that's what the story always is. And these guys can't, I mean, for what it's worth, these guys can't catch warm bodies in like the Modern Challenge or the online queues or whatever. So like, Arena League is like 1,000 times beneath that. Like these guys are like, oh, we'll test the strategy on Mythic Arena and we'll go 10-0 and then we'll play we'll go 3-3 at the RC, and it's kind of like nothing you can do, right? Like you can only at that point you're forced to bring it in house. I mean, you made that comment about Worlds, which is just that like people are like, I feel like my Mythic data is better than what these guys came in their house. But the thing is, they can never these guys can never trust the Mythic data because the Mythic data is always like hurting them.
But look, like half their decks were literal disasters.
Yeah, but the thing is, like they don't know, they can't get a leg up on each other, right? If they're just going off like playing in Mythic.
The deck that won was really cool and inventive, right? But it wasn't, you know what I'm saying? Like it wasn't one of these weird disaster decks.
But at the end of the day, it's just like it's just painful because it's so hard to get anything. Like it's so hard to know anything. Basically, at the end of the day,
so the problem with Magic, if you want to care about winning in tournaments right now, the problem is that there's a huge imbalance between how many tournaments there are to obtain glory, how many rounds are in those tournaments, how many times you can lose in order to be in the winner's circle, and the frequency that the tournaments come up. Those things are way out of whack in a way that they were not in some previous years, right? Like in some previous eras of the Pro Tour, for example, there were way fewer rounds, right? So the problem with the number of rounds that we have in large tournaments now is that the best players end up losing at the wrong time, right? Like they cannibalize against themselves. At there's a point in the tournament where they come together, they cannibalize against themselves. Now the best players are all eliminated, and like random fish come up from this weird shape. That is directly a result of too many rounds in the tournaments. The problem is you can't not have that many rounds in the tournaments because there's so many players. Right, so that
is a weird thesis.
So the first time this happened, where I noticed this was
let's take a big pause to the side, which is that you can't control. You have to control for the population size. You're saying there was less variance because but the less variance could just because the terms were less dense.
So what ended up,
of course more fish are going to advance if the number of pros stays the same and the player pool doubles.
Yeah. So an example of this happening, I mean, Chapin actually top-8'd this Pro Tour, which was great, but it was not with the best deck. At the end of day one, almost the entire like top of the standings was Cawblade. Cawblade obviously became the greatest standard deck of all time, right? And it won the Pro Tour also. But the entire top of day one was Cawblade, right? Then you go into day two. What ends up happening? All the guys who were on the same team with each other that went like 8-0 on 7-0 on day one mathematically eliminate each other because they got paired against other undefeated players. And then what ended up happening is all the players who weren't them that were 2 rounds below rise up in the last round of the tournament, which is why we didn't have 8 Cawblades in the top 8. Like literally all of the undefeated players killed each other.
I mean, I guess like that's just how large tournaments work. It's just like winning players get paired against each other. Yeah, and also you're heavily advantaged by your tiebreakers to win earlier. So like even if you do
but then they mathematically eliminate each other. That was the problem, right? Like all the XO guys get paired against each other. Half of them become X1s, right? Then those guys
I mean obviously it depends on the cut, but then that's just saying, I mean, I don't know. I sort of see where you're coming from, but I don't think that it makes sense like broadly, because like you're basically saying that the XOs necessarily have to lose, and that they're falling into a larger population of X1s, and then they're mingling with that population, but they have to lose again. So they're not necessarily. Oh, so they get pared down from top tie breaks.
But now when
so it's just because you pair down from top to bottom, right? So
now when they're in the X2s, it becomes this weird homogeny. Right?
Yeah, well, it's because you pair top to bottom. So if all your best X1s are people who start at XO, then they have to fight each other, and then if X1's the cut, then they're going to be on equal footing as somebody who has bad breakers at the bottom of X1. But this is effectively, but the solution
never get paired against the randoms until the last round.
The solution to this problem is, well, yeah, I mean, then they have to lose there. But the solution to this problem is to play more rounds, not fewer.
Oh, and then there's more losses.
Yeah. It's stratified. Like, and the fact, like the rounds being determined by tournament size just increases the variance, right? So like, if you have, I don't think it holds water, Mike. I think that if you went to Karsten and was like, this is my thesis, 80% players are going to miss top 8 more in large fields. Like they're not going to miss I don't think they're going to miss top 8 more in like in the large fields that doesn't linearly scale with the size of the field, right? Because obviously the more rounds you play, you're 80%, you'll get busted being an 80% player.
I mean,
you have to solve this with a simulation. So
yeah, so I mean, I'm just saying, obviously we have a finite number of instances of this happening, but it's quite common for like the top teams to have. Obviously, there's more than 8 people in the top teams, right? But those guys are all at the top of day one.
I get.
They're only half of.
I get what you're saying, but for what you're saying to be mathematically true, like you'd have to run sims. Like what you're saying is qualitatively true, but the thing is, the problem with that is just that it's too colored by your sample, right? Because the pro teams aren't like a sample of 80% people, because you're basically saying it is harder for you somehow or you're saying that there's an overrepresentation of players with less edge in top 8s the larger that tournaments get. And I'm saying that only happens because of variance.
I don't know if that's true. What I would say is true is if you look at the cutoffs at the end of day one, right? Well, you can't, right? There's more than eight players at that point, right? There's typically density of teams and density of deck strategies, and that those things are almost always cockeyed by the end of day 2.
Yeah, but that's
the result of those players eliminating each other,
right? But
they literally, the best players kill each other.
Yeah, but we talked about this. Rise. I mean, we talked about this with the elves discussion. You basically play 3 tournaments, right? You play the first half of the tournament in which you're mingling with fish. You're playing the second half of the tournament where you're like playing against sharks, and then you play the top 8 elimination, and like. You're saying that sharks eat each other and that fish can somehow swim up. It's like, well, the fish have to swim up from the X1 bracket. They have less to win. And the one thing that helps your theory is that conceivably, because there's clean cuts, because tournaments don't actually run, like the thesis is the opposite. You would actually have to run more rounds, right? But because there's clean cuts, you get put in a situation where there's a population of 16 people who can go X1 or better, right? And the matchups get paired down top to bottom. So that means that edge players at the top are going to necessarily eliminate each other so long as they can't handshake in. So let's just say it's a clean cut, right? So that everybody has to play in the top 16. The top players can't handshake in and the bottom players can't handshake in. But the thing is, the bracket gets paired top to bottom. So the people who started 0-1 and then ran it all the way up, they're playing against each other. And the people who started XO and then ran it to X1, they're playing against each other. There's no weighted pairing where top X1s get a fight bottom X1s. And then that means there's an overrepresentation of X1 with fewer breakers.
Everybody at the same record is randomly paired, right? Like
No, everybody, it's paired. Pairings are top to bottom
at a record.
At a record, yeah. So if there's 4 people who are XO and then there's 2 people with 60% OMW and 2 people with 50% OMW, the 50s play each other unless they played each other earlier in the tournament.
I feel like the top players are often paired against each other with like 2 rounds to go.
That's because they have matching opponent match percentage. That's what I'm saying. It gets paired top to bottom. Your standings at the end of the round are determined by your opponent match percentage, right?
Yeah.
So if you start XO and your opponent starts XO, and then both of you lost to get knocked down to X1, that increases the likelihood that you'll play against each other because you'll have similar OMWs.
I would have guessed, well, not guessed, but maybe I'm missing something. It sounds to me, based on your description, that at the same record, then we should be playing opposite of each other. So like the highest OMW should be playing against
the reason why we don't do that is it allows people to draw in. If you get opposite paired, then the top person couldn't draw with the bottom person. And then you'd be pushing out the top person from being able to draw in, whereas the people in the middle all of a sudden could draw in.
I thought, so this is wrong. I just thought it was random.
No, it's top to bottom. I mean, it's not. I'm not saying it's top to bottom always.
Oh wait, it's top against top.
Yeah,
down.
It gets paired top to bottom. 1 gets paired with 2, 3 gets paired with 4.
I thought you were saying 1 gets paired with N, 2 gets
no,
paired
no,
with
yeah. Sorry.
I completely
no. I'm saying you're reading top to bottom. You're pairing the bracket, not top against bottom. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So, but that actually just reinforces my point, which is that the best.
Yeah, that's why I made it.
All the best players.
That's why I said it, Mike. That's why I said it. Okay. And the reason why then the remedy for this is to play another round. Like,
what if the remedy should just be to randomly pair at each round?
Then you could never draw in. Then it would be it randomly decided who could draw in.
So you just want to have more losses able to be in the top 8.
Effectively, yeah, and that's actually how larger tournaments are structured, because the Pro Tour is like X4, X3 makes the cut, right? It's not an
X4 often.
X4 often, right? So it's not they play more rounds, and that's just because they can't get. They actually have to play, like Swiss breaks down, right? So you can't just go double, double, double. At some point, the Swiss breaks down. And you actually have to play an extra round to get a fair Swiss.
Well, I'm just putting this in air quotes. My thought on this about having too many rounds actually came from Watu. They're like, I think we run too many rounds because the good players kill each other. That's actually
Yeah, well, I don't know that you can do it one of two ways. You can do it where you have a top 8. You have a single elimination tournament, right?
That's the worst way.
And your top 8 is literally, if you lose a match, you lose. If you're going to have a cut at X1, then whatever. But
that's a good way to have like 25% fish minimum.
You'd have to go no IDs. You'd have to do no IDs and then pair top against bottom like I described. But because you invite IDs into your system, it's super good to have XOs play against each other at the highest win rates. And actually, I think it's overall kind of wrong, right? Because in like a 12 round, I mean, it breaks down at 12, 14 rounds, right? But in a 10 rounder, there's like double scoop scenarios, and most people at the top can double scoop in. So that's like extremely advantageous for them making the cut, an extremely huge reason,
That used to happen all the time, but that was when Pro Tours were smaller. Yeah.
So because you pretty much can't fix it in the larger Pro Tour without playing more rounds, and they actually do fix it because they make it once you get 12 wins, you're automatically in, and then there's no IDs involved, and then the last round, whatever. But that 12-0 start gives you an effective double scoop, and then all the rest happens. It's still really, really good to start a tournament XO, and
Yeah,
I
look,
don't.
obviously,
I
winning
don't
the
know.
most is best. I
And,
agree.
Yeah, I think you have a higher percentage of low opponent match win rate players making it into top 8, but
Yeah,
only in the 7th and 8th place spot. And so that just means that the
look,
strong players just lose when it matters, which
there's
is
only
kind of
two
like
ways. There's only two ways to think about this. One of them is plot armor, right? Okay. Plot armor is one of the two ways to think about this. I think it's funny that you think that like my statistics are bad or whatever, when the reality is you can be a 75% win rate player, which is extraordinarily good, and you're not favored to win 2 rounds in a row, right? Like that is like the reality of of tournament magic, right? Like that's why you keep then like, you know, getting close to the top 8 is great. Being the top 8 is better, right? But like
that's kind of an oversimplification, right? Because if you're a 75% win rate player, you're 75% blended, right? But let's assume that you're a you start at 90 and then each round you go slightly down a peg on average. But like the true variance, like the true variance of it is that like you play 2 tournaments, one is against Fish, who you dominate, and you know, you will dominate, and then you also have a loss to give, right? And then you play the next tournament, like, because you'll be a 75% player, but you're playing against a 40% player, right? So I
literally played against Selden first round 2 years ago and Andy first round last year. I don't have the benefit of the Fish tournament that you imagine that.
No, you're the Fish in that scenario.
Oh, I'm the Fish.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Like Andy and Selden are sitting down across from you, and they're like rubbing their hands together. They're like, oh, that's the 45% player I was trying to get paired against.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, I understand now.
Don't get me wrong. I find a way to lose during the Fish tournament more times than I'd like to admit, but that's magic, baby. Like, you know.
No, that's what I'm saying, right? Like I, for good or ill, right? I mean, I think that you would agree with me at least on this one. I think that I am an excellent red deck heads up player.
Yeah.
Right. Sure. Right. Like that is a thing. And
well,
like
I have my doubts now that it turns out that Lan and Andy are like the 2 best red players in the house.
Lan and why? I don't understand this.
Because they were pointing out all your punts.
Oh, did I have punts? I blocked.
Yeah,
this
you
out.
have punts. Yeah, you blocked them out. Yeah. Like Lan was just pissed because we're sitting there. You and Dix are supposed to be like the 2 best red players, and he's just like, "Didn't you give up damage?" Like he's just. Like,
I don't think I gave up damage.
Happening?
I gave up timing because I wanted to explode the car. That is true. I blew up the car, but that was a time.
Listen, we like the only way to settle this is the Mike versus Lan red deck.
But you know, like, you still get out. You just draw more fire blasts than you. That's the thing.
Yeah. I mean,
Year 1 can't be interacted with.
I mean, Lan was also annoyed because he was just like, this matchup is just variance. You guys are pretending like you have anything to say about who wins.
I mean, Nate drew.
Yeah, they drew more fire blasts when you lose, and I'm a skilled red player when you win. That is the problem. You're identifying the problem. But you can't be skilled when you win and unlucky when you lose. Like, we agree on that.
Can't you? That's my thesis.
Yeah, that's the problem. That's a gigantic leak, right? It's the inability to see when you get lucky. But that's human nature.
Isn't it an ability to see when you get lucky? I mean, like the red deck, especially to play to your outs, right? Like that's like a big part of it.
I mean, the fact that you are even in a position to have outs is thanks to the order of your deck. Like,
but it's a low resource deck. You have to play a certain way.
Yeah, I understand, but you still like. We're talking about the mirror here. Like Lan's thesis is that you don't have a lot of agency in the mirror. Your thesis is that you do. Except for you complain when your opponent draws more fire blasts, or your opponent, like you drew lands and your opponent still had Jackal Pup. Like you always have something. Yeah, always have something because you're like, oh, I only lose because I got unlucky.
Well, no, like the strategy in sideboarded games is to make it difficult for your opponent to get.
I understand all this.
But you can't interact with gear one. That's actually the problem. You can have an overarchingly
right.
great
That
strategy,
that is supportive
right?
of what land. That is supportive of what land thinks.
No, but there's all the other games, right? And
right, but
those are.
But Land's thesis is just that one, you and your opponent are more likely to be on equal footing than not, and then two, at that point, the order of your deck matters. I mean, fundamentally, if you're saying that one person can draw a second Fire Blast and that changes it, like that's a lot different from the Burn Mirror match versus the Rock Mirror match, right?
The Rock Mirror match?
Just like any mirror match that isn't Burn.
Somebody falls asleep first.
Yeah, probably.
The other person takes all their cards.
I would assume that it's whoever gets deranged and stronghold together. But
I was thinking recurring nightmare seems pretty hard to beat.
Yeah, but then you just duress it, right? You can't. You can't interact with the Volraths unless you have your Dust Bowl. So you're just like one against one.
It depends what version. If it's like Lanny Rock versus Lanny Rock, or like if it's these survival decks against each other, I think it's just like it's probably about survival and then mana. Like if one person has survival, then that person's probably going to win. If both people have survival, the guy with more mana is probably going to win. Like that. That's what I'm imagining, because like your order of operations should just be to get your Withered Wretch and eat their squee opportunistically, right? Like you can't expose it in a way that
it's always exposed. It's always in your graveyard on the upkeep, right? So, and you also have no way of removing a black creature from the battlefield.
Man, this is wild. This is like now it's like super draw dependent. Then I don't even know how you would win. Right? It's actually who draws. It's like
it's mill them.
Like who has more lands and then who has more spells.
I think it's just mill them.
No, I think like one player's likely to get critical mass, right? Like
I think it's whoever has more Tempting Wurms.
You think Tempting Wurm is a breaker here?
You can't. Nothing blocks it. So the Tempting Wurm's the only way to get ahead on board.
You can Bone Shredder it.
I mean, that's true, but you can try. I mean, what else have you got? Okay, so it's Bone Shredder against Bone Shredder because they're flyers.
Well, I don't know. Like I'm saying I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know either.
This is like crazy because like obviously survival or no is like the first question, right? If one guy has survival, the other guy doesn't.
So this is also a mirror where you have no agency because neither player can win the game. So whoever's on the draw loses.
No, decking is a thing.
Yeah, whoever's on the draw loses.
Right. So I think, but like I think it's more lands followed by more spells. Is the because like if you have more lands, you can develop your survival.
Yeah, I mean you'll draw one extra card, right? So if you both have survival, then if you're on the play, you can put Withered Wretch into play.
Well, there's also like, what if both players have a priority for Withered Wretch, is there a Withered Wretch Graveborn Muse question? Because Withered Wretch and Graveborn Muse in the same time is quite powerful, but it might kill you, right? Like,
yeah, and you'd have to Cabal Therapy them away.
3-3? Yeah, this is whack.
This should be like the test. Like the survival rock mirror should be like the. I mean, once we find out if it's skill dependent, that should be like the player test. That like whoever wins the survival rock mirror is the better Magic player. End of discussion.
We used to have this thought process about
that should be the new Dan. Survival rock.
There's just like all these different temporary solutions. Like, what if you have like a mana advantage? You just go get Sadistic Hypnotist and then you hypnotize them, right? So like now you're way ahead and you haven't gotten your Squee or your Withered Wretch yet. Or maybe you got your Withered Wretch, but not your Squee. But like they don't have any hands, so they're like peeling off the top.
Yeah. So then maybe it is just luck. It's just whoever
lands first.
Yeah, whoever wins first. Because it's like in the Dreadnought mirror, it's like whoever goes second, whoever jams second is the one who's going to win, and so you just never jam. In this mirror, it's actually pretty straightforward. It's whoever goes first. And then burn, it can be like complicated or whatever, and there's all this.
No, I think it's super draw dependent because it's about like this deck. Honestly, you just don't play your third land a bunch of the time, right? So like if one guy just has lands,
yeah, but we're just saying you just get to survival. I mean, obviously, if you get to survival and you have no lands, that's a problem, right? But like you have to get to survival. The other person's not going to like
because there's like the Squee. the Squee Genesis Withered.
I mean, they're just not going to win if they don't get to survival. Like, neither player is going to be able to do something that wins the game before survival gets drawn. So it's whoever draws survival first. But you can't draw it too soon because you'll get a duressed.
Man, duress Cabal Therapy in the mid game is so bad, right? Because it's just two idiots slapping.
Yeah, it doesn't get anything. It literally just doesn't get anything. All right, we're at 2.5 hours. This might be another one of the bad ones.
This is the worst podcast I've ever been on.
It's probably the worst. Yeah, it's rough. Last one was rough too. Last one was pretty bad. We have to recalibrate.
I just wanted to talk about my match. You just wanted to criticize me.
I did. I still think that you have these leaks, like, you know.
I think that the end game thing is a real leak, right? I think that you're overly hard on me and most of the other stuff.
I mean, I just want to bring in it's like kind of, it's difficult to do without playing it. Like I'll totally will concede that, which is just that, like, if I sat down to the deck and got to that point, I might be at the point where I'm just like, holy crap, like the odds really are like 15% of the time lose on the spot. Like, I would never cast this card. Like, if that were the case, that's fine. I have a hard time seeing that's the case. You know, and the situation I think is flipped in the Ponza black green example where, you know, Fran's held the cards and like whatever, and that's all we have at the end of the day.
Example really smells like the 7 counter spells example to me. Just
no, I mean,
infinite turns. You can sculpt whatever game plan you want and
Mike,
never lose.
I see that. You don't have, like, I got it. I'm just saying that you know, when, like, experiencing it firsthand is the best way to get some sort of qualitative analysis on it. And I think that's kind of where I was trying to steer towards, which is just that we are a vibes podcast at the end of the day. We are not a data podcast. We try to use data as a vehicle when we talk about these bets, because those are the odds that we believe in the bets, right? It's like betting on sports, right? Like, you're just kind of like, at the end of the day, it's just a bunch of guys like running into each other, and you can't predict like what's going to happen. There's way too many variables in play. And like, the best that you can do is that you can sit and you can be like, I think that the odds makers are wrong on this one because, you know, they're not weighing some sort of variable heavily enough. And that's basically what we're doing against each other, because at the end of the day, we won't be able to test 1,000 matches and like whatever. So, you know, I'm skeptical. I try to be skeptical of myself, and maybe I just like don't do a good job of it. I have a hard time like sort of figuring that to some extent recently. I mean, I don't know. Pre-modern is like you said, it's just, there's just not enough opportunities to play. So you have to cling on to like whatever.
Not enough opportunities to play that matter, right? Like,
yeah,
I don't know. You don't play in paper monthlies, right?
Not the webcam, no, not anymore.
Like, I have no interest in playing in them, right?
Yeah,
like
I used to.
Yeah, like I don't have an MTGO account. Like,
I don't know, but that's like kind of where that's where it's important to have skepticism, like where skepticism should take the forefront, right? It's like, just because I win every time I play Grotog doesn't mean that it's a good deck. And actually, like, I think
Grotog is a better deck than most people gave it credit for a long time.
That is true, but it's still not like like my position going into LobsterCon wouldn't have been to recommend that somebody else plays it, and it was more like me throwing my hands up and just kind of giving up on deck selection, basically.
Of the information that we had, I really do think that it was the best deck you could pick. Like, if you had known better about Dr. Surf and Surf, you maybe should.
Yeah. But that's outside of it. Well, part of the problem was like I got the matchups that I wanted. I didn't win them, so I just drew. So I don't actually know what you make of that. Like, I don't think you should make anything of that, because I could have just as easily run into Red Green Oath and then just lost without having a chance. And that was something that I couldn't fix about the deck. And ultimately the reason why it wasn't a good choice, right? Like, my match against SWB in the final Swiss round was not a win-in, but like, you know, the fact that if it was, I would have lost is just kind of like goes against exactly everything I would say about deck selection, which is just like, don't play decks that lose to like a deck that you expect to face when you're XO.
I mean, what would you assess? So I lost 2 matches. We already talked about the one that I lost in the last round. The other match that I lost was against Red Green Oath. I had 3 turns to draw either any land or any 1-mana burn spell. And I failed to draw 3 turns. What lesson can you take out of that? I literally drew like 3 Jackal-Pups or something. Like over a 3-turn period. Any land or any 1-mana burn spell, I win the game.
Well, we can give ourselves the grace of saying, like, you know, we did the most that we could. And in your position, we've already talked about it. You just didn't have testing time. So it was just more straightforward because you had more, more experience to stand on for playing red than you would like sort of pivoting, right? But then also the ability to like look and see that other people were, you know, more effective at what they were doing. And also probably some percentage of it was just like probably just play Dreadnought, you know, kind of thing. Because like we can probably play it like a little bit better than Itai, and Itai did pretty good. So
yeah, but like every time I play Dreadnought, I win obviously way more than I've lost the tournament. I played it in like $1,000 tournament. I made top 4, but like I guess I only lost to you in that tournament. Now, like
now let me think about it. Yeah,
I only lost to you, right? But I learned so much, which is like one of the reasons why I think I had a good shot in the Black-Green versus Dreadnought matchup, even though I ended up losing it today. Which is that like Dreadnought's a combo deck in the mid game. You can really stop them from comboing. Like if you have black cards.
Don't disagree. They do have to find their way into your hand, and obviously you have to get a little bit lucky. I think you actually have to kind of get a lot of bit lucky. These days, my my like Dreadnought getting lucky, you getting lucky against Dreadnought is like kind of shortening, where I'm just kind of like, you really like I'm feeling what people are feeling, which is just that like it's kind of tough. Like it's kind of tough that you can sort of do everything right and still lose. You experienced that firsthand. I guess I haven't technically experienced that yet because a lot of the time I'm the Dreadnought player. But you know, the fact that some 5 to 10% of the time they just have unbelievable luck, you know, but like that's like a huge percentage of the time. So it's not really unbelievable luck. It's just like, you know, making a straight, right? It's just kind of like if your deck can't make a straight and their deck can, like you're in trouble. Your deck can't make a straight or a flush and their deck can. It's like you're super, super in trouble. And it's like it makes it really, really hard to like be like, this deck is good against Dreadnought. In fact, like the only deck that I really somebody was like I don't think any deck is 2-1 against Dreadnought. And I was like, I would lay 2-1 with Grotog, I think. It's just like,
so the thing is the Black-Green deck is better than 2-1 against Dreadnought after sideboarding. The problem is you lose game 1 100% of the time.
Yeah, so
literally lost the game.
So literally the best odds that you can be is 2-1 if you win 100% of the sideboard game. So that means mathematically speaking, you're probably less than 2-1.
So like, you know, bad beat stories are $1 or whatever, right? But like, you know, at some point, like I blundered game 1 against Kaplan, right? So I had 2 opportunities to use my sadistic hypnotist that probably would have won the game.
Yeah,
I used it neither,
and that would have launched your match equity through the roof. So right,
but like what I didn't mention was like he not only runnered me there on both of those turns, but then he also had all 4 Dreadnoughts in the top 20 cards. Like if he just doesn't have the 4th Dreadnought, I still win the game. And then he's just like, oh, now I have the 4th Dreadnought. Sweet.
Yeah.
I can attack because he couldn't attack me because I had enough power.
Yeah, I mean it's crazy. It's crazy how good the deck is. I mean that's kind of the the bottom thing. Well, this was pretty bad, right? Because we didn't talk about Martin Berlin unbanning a black card potentially.
Yeah, he can't. He has to unban 2 black cards.
We didn't talk about. I had this idea that like counter spells and card draw are too good, and the fact that they're in the same color is like fundamentally the problem, because like the card quality in pre-modern is very stratified, right? So if the blue decks always find their good cards and the green, black, white, and red decks,
there's no problem. Okay, we agreed in that, right?
No, we agree, right? But I think it's like a vibes thing where it's like blue decks get to play a consistent game and not blue decks don't play a consistent game, and like that's like creating like this like sort of negative environment. I think you see it in Legacy too, where there's like, oh, Brainstorm Ponder, like blah blah blah.
I'm of 2 minds of this. First of all, I just don't care about the thing you're saying at all. This black green deck is excellent. It is excellent for reasons that, I think we have to
It's
recognize.
just survival of the fittest. The reason is survival of the fittest.
There's other survival of the fittest decks. This deck is excellent.
There aren't very many other survival decks.
This deck is excellent in part because Oath Ponza is not played. I am very confident of that, and we could prove it if it's not even that interesting, but this is just what I think. Okay. But like the red deck is excellent. People like to play goblins. There's a wide variety. That's one thing. The second, and they have things that are beneficial to them other than card draw and counter spells in the same deck, right? The other thing is whether or not you want to strengthen black. Okay. These are two different things, right? And so Martin's talking about strengthening black. I think that you can't just unban. I don't know. Maybe you can unban Necro. It doesn't seem great to me. I guess maybe Necropotence 4 Ivory Tower might be a disaster. Maybe that's great. I don't know.
Well, the problem that Martin identified is that black doesn't have effective creatures. And sort of fundamentally, if you want to strengthen a color, you need win conditions in that color. And so black doesn't have good win conditions, maybe, besides Tendrils of Agony. And Tendrils of Agony as a win condition is like major suck for everybody who's playing against black. And First like it doesn't strengthen quote unquote black as a color so much as it strengthens Dark Ritual as a card. So there's kind of that, right? But that's like the bottom line, right? It's like
you could why wouldn't you just play Free Spell Necro? Like the dominating Necropotence deck and extended for a 2-year period had between 2 and 4.
I'm not talking about that. Like the win condition for Necro isn't creatures, it's Necro, right? Like,
well, you have to actually be able to win, but it's
but the
Dark Ritual
like
and Drain Life.
Once again, it's like that becomes the identifying like thing. So like the win condition is so irrelevant at that point, right? It's like land tax wasn't a white card.
No, that is not a good analysis. The win condition matters a lot because those drains do two things. They shorten the opponent's life total and they make your Necropotence continue to go at the same time.
Okay, I mean
that's how Davis didn't beat Maher.
Yeah, I mean I think that's
one of those two things became unhitched in all the games.
No, don't get me wrong. I think that it is interesting that like the deck would win by casting Drain Life, but I don't know. I'm still in the middle of this. So basically, we have Oath Ponza, which wins with a green creature and man lands. We have Dreadnought, which wins with a blue creature. We have Goblins, which wins with red creatures. No deck really wins with white creatures. That's like good, but at least there are white identifying deck that sometimes put Exalted Angel and like Silver Knight onto the battlefield. So those
Exalted Angel and Eternal Dragon are ways that
those are like collectively what we would call white decks, but they're not like stunners, right? And the real white win condition right now is Opalescence.
I mean, Flippy wins with white creatures.
I understand. I'm just saying, like, if we're taking a very like bird's eye view of just like how colored the format is, like white is in a weird place where its win condition is Opalescence at the highest rate of representation, and the rest is just an amalgam, right? Like, there's plenty of green win cons, and they all come in different flavors because there's no efficient creatures in any other color. Like at the right scale, right? And then black has all these creatures that are just super bad against lightning bolt, going in any direction. So part of strengthening black's identity is like a lot of people are just like, oh well, black is a support color, and it's just kind of like, well, what would be a good thing to make it a main color? They just didn't make black cards that win the game that are balanced, right? They just made ones that win the game that are super unbalanced. Like, if you're saying like, I'm not going to be like getting drain lifed and just being like, well, thank God I'm losing to a different color card.
None of this makes any sense to me. Okay. Nobody did the thing that you're saying. Pre-modern is a made-up format of like a bunch of stuff that was never intended to be played together. Turns out it's pretty cool.
I'm playing devil's advocate here because I'm trying to like identify, because one of the problems that the black is underrepresented crowd has made was that like they're like, oh well, it's a support color, and it's just like, okay, well, what's a support color? Like, is blue a support color to colorless when it comes to Phyrexian Dreadnought? Like, what?
Black is black. If you just didn't have a banned list, right? So you won the You won the Bah Humbug,
with
right?
a black deck. Yeah,
How did your black cards feel,
the
Lanny?
black cards were pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. If we didn't have a banned list, no one would be making the argument that black is a support color. The problem is the black cards are too good, not that they're too weak.
Right. So how would you solve the problem? That's the thing, is like, I think it's an intractable issue, right?
I don't think you have to. Like I said,
Agree.
If you had to, I would unban Yawgmoth's Will and Necropode.
Well, I guess you were the wrong person to invite to play devil's advocate, because I'm struggling with the same question, which is just like, if black isn't a support color and it's not a color that is absolutely unhinged crushing everyone thanks to Yawg-Will and Necro or Tendrils, or Entomb is like, I don't buy. Some people make the argument that Entomb would be used in a blue deck, but I'm kind of like, I think Entomb Reanimate would just be the best thing that you can do with Entomb, and that would be a black deck.
I think that, you know, there's the policy question, which is the bigger thing. I think like Entomb is very much like sort of an Oath of Druids land tax situation, which is that like it makes a format that people can't play. But like it's just too prohibitive, right? Like you have a card that's basically, I don't know, like Demonic Tutor, Tinker, and like, I don't know, Demonic Tutor, Tinker, and like a Chroma. Sometimes it's actually a Chroma, right? Like all at the same time, which is like, what card makes it so my opponent can't win on turn 2?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, can't play. Like not even
right.
Like,
it's like Multani.
Right?
It's Multani here, Nishoba there, a Chroma in the third column, and Symbiotic Worm in the fourth.
Yeah,
so.
you know, it could even be like Stronghold Taskmaster. You know, in some universes, there's situations like that.
I guess what I think would be crazy is that I guess Entomb would be in the blue deck, because what you could do is, instead of playing Putrid Imp, Careful Study, you can just play cantrips, and you can play the equivalent to the Psychic Frog Reanimator deck in Legacy, which is like just cantrips until it finds Entomb Reanimate, and doesn't have to play wow,
that sounds fun.
Doesn't have to play like Dark Ritual, Putrid Imp, Animate Dead, you know, these like sort of clunker cards, or you know, whatever. Careful Study is pretty bad, you know, because it's just like, oh, I'm trying to draw this nonsense and Careful Study at the same time so that I can Careful Study it to my graveyard. It's like, let's just
Entomb. You need to dump your Rorix.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong. Like, Faithless Looting is in a Reanimator deck for a reason, but like, I'm just saying it's super better sometimes to just like only have Entomb as your outlet.
I'm not disagreeing with you. So what I'm saying, and I've said this a bunch of times, is if you only unban Yawgmoth's Will, that's just a tool for intuition.
Absolutely.
If you need to make black better, you need to unban multiple things.
Yeah, I was looking at my Ill-Gotten Gains deck, and I was just like, this is such a black deck, and then I looked at it, I'm like, it's just Rituals and Ill-Gotten Gains, and the rest of it are blue cards, and the win con is a blue card, and I'm like, never mind.
Seriously, like, the best thing to do if they just unban Yawgmoth's Will is just intuitioning for baubles, right? You just intuition for baubles and intuition.
No, I think that you should probably intuition for Lion's Eye Diamond. Like, I think that's better, but you know, we can agree to disagree.
Well, the intuitioning for baubles you can play a mid-range deck and
No, I'm familiar with the line you're taking. I'm just saying that I don't agree that the best thing to do would be intuition for baubles. I think
you could just put the Lion's Eye Diamonds into play and not use them. Yeah, I mean,
well, you would probably use them to cast all the other stuff in your graveyard, right?
Yeah,
you would probably use them to cast a series of Rituals and Cunning Wish for Brain Freeze, and then your opponent.
Yeah, maybe we can't unban Yawgmoth's Will at all,
like,
right? Like,
it was crazy to me that you got so excited about the bauble thing, because I'm just like, I don't know. I've played one copy of Yawgmoth's Will and one copy of Lion's Eye Diamond in a deck, and let me tell you, 4 copies of each sounds like I would never lose. But that might not be the case. I've got people telling me like, well, if I have one Tormod's Crypt, you're gonna have nothing to say about that. To which I say, like, I don't know. I get access to like 20 extra cards. Like
my stupid black green deck beat first turn Phyrexian Furnace and multiple Tormod's Crypts in mono blue multiple times on Tuesday. So I feel like a deck that has an actual intuition might have something to say about, you know.
Yeah, I would probably intuition for Chain of Vapor, I suppose. Like, it just wouldn't be that hard. Like, you go down a card when you play Tormod's Crypt. That's like really tough for your beatdown deck to like, make the rest work, because you'll be down a spell, and spells shorten the clock.
You want like Sphere of Resistance.
Yeah, that's good. That's a little tastier. It's still similar in that like I'll probably find a way, but it at least makes things interesting. You really want,
how some people are,
if you got Spheres of Resistance and Crypt, then we're cooking, right?
You know how some people are just Gear 3 is just slow Gear 1?
Yeah,
like that.
I think that's me.
This.
That's a me.
It's not. So Gear 1 is you make your opponent's game as short as possible, right? I'm sorry, you make your game as short as possible.
You kill them, yeah.
Yeah. Gear 2 is you make your opponent's your opponent's game long as possible.
You stop them from killing you, yeah.
Yeah. Gear 3 is
you kill them eventually.
Yeah. So, but
it's sort of both, right?
No,
because
you're doing, but they're like
you're doing
they're literally
two.
The opposite.
Well, you're doing two, but you're
I play
using
fast. One of them is I play slow.
Right. So it's interesting because fundamentally the kill them in a very basic example is just like I cannot kill them without the card Phyrexian Dreadnought. Now that's not always the case, but let's just say it is, right? And then you're like, well, I can't kill them with Phyrexian Dreadnought because my opponent can stop Phyrexian Dreadnought too well. So instead, I need to stop everything that my opponent's doing. And once I've done that, I will then play Phyrexian Dreadnought, which they can't stop. But the similarity between the fact that your opponent is dying to Phyrexian Dreadnought, or in the other cases, Fire Blast, leads me to basically say it's just this. It's just same but different. Like I know it's different, but it's like
this podcast is already super long, and
it's just like you could have a brisket, which is like slow roasted and cooked, and whatever, or you can just have a steak that you just like ripped it on the grill. You'd have them in different time span, but you're still eating beef. They're
different experiences. So the thing
exactly, they are different.
I've watched a lot of people play Dreadnought over the years that I've played pre-modern. I've watched Fran play, and the one thing that I will say, an overwhelming amount that I've noticed, is Dave Kaplan wins with multiple Dreadnoughts in play at a rate that I've never seen any other player. Like that's how he beat me today. Like I could beat the first Dreadnought even with my screw ups, but I couldn't beat 2 in play.
That's the plot armor.
There's the fourth gear, which is overwhelming number of Dreadnoughts, right? Like because you're like, oh, how do I get the Dreadnought? Is
that's just like a second engine that you added, right? It's like, the dual.
The question is like, how do I keep the Dreadnought?
Dual motor, right? You've got 2 engines and they're both in Gear 1.
So Gear 1 is just like, I get the Dreadnought, I got you, right? Gear 2 is, I'm going to run them out of shit so they can't kill my Dreadnought. Kaplan gear, whatever gear it is just
gear
more
K.
Dreadnoughts.
Yeah. I mean, the Tempting Wurm for 2 Dreadnought story is pretty sick. Like
that's insanity.
It is. It would make me question everything. It would make me be like, okay, instead of Tempting Wurm, I have to play Hidden Gibbons. Those would all be different, interesting.
Yeah, but they're such different cards. Like Hidden Gibbons, for example, can't be discarded to a survival defense. That's a real thing.
No. It's an interesting discussion. I'm just saying that the experience of my opponent putting 2 Phyrexian Dreadnoughts in play, would make me want to play Hidden Gibbons, right? Also, so I would have 1 Tempting Wurm that I can pull with survival, and then I'd have Gibbons because I think that I'll have enough creatures next to my survival.
I think we're like fixated on the wrong thing also, and maybe this doesn't matter because I haven't played the matchup, but I feel like this deck is probably very challenging for the red deck to beat. But Tempting Wurm is just outstanding against the red deck.
It's true.
That's like,
and Hidden Gibbons is much worse against the red deck than
it's
Tempting
like
Wurm
super
is.
Medium, right? Like it's good, but like the problem is the turn that they turn it on might be the turn that they kill.
Yeah. That you might die.
Yeah.
But it is interesting because what it would do in this scenario, we waited 3 hours to get to the analysis. What it would do in this scenario is that, like, they have a problem, which is they can't get any offense together through your walls, right? So they don't have the walls option. Then what they're left with is just instants. But if you are an astute viewer, you might count the instants in the red deck and stop at 8. Like it might be post sideboard, and they might just have Bolts Incinerate because some red decks just play Seal of Fire. And then what are the other instants? Fire Blast, you're dead.
Well, the first card that you take out is Jackal Pup.
Right.
That card has like it's never going to deal any damage. Maybe it does 2,
Right.
and it'll never
Agreed.
deal damage in a game.
We could took Jackal Pup out against just Wall of Blossoms, so we take it
like
out even harder against Blossoms plus Roots.
Blossoms plus Roots plus Tempting Wurm.
Yeah.
I mean, like that's the rub, right? So I think that the main game plan has got to be something around Sulfuric Vortex, and I don't think that they're very good at dealing with They obviously can deal with Sulfuric Vortex, but I don't think they're very good at it.
Yeah.
Right? Like they probably have one Nantuko. I mean, would you have your naturalizes in against red deck? Like
I might, just because I know I would against me if I sat down and I was like, Lanny's my opponent, I would have naturalize. But
so maybe it's right.
Because the only way you really lose is the combination of instant burn, but again, a lot of it can be held back. No. And Grim Lavamancer, Sulfuric Vortex, and I guess Curse Scroll.
This is a weird situation. Grim Lavamancer's super medium in this matchup. Right? It's so good against most of the other survival decks. It's like, what is it even killing? Am I going to shoot a bird with this thing?
You're probably just going face.
How do I go face?
I mean, it's your only way to win, right? Is to reduce your opponent's life total to 0. You can't clear it away.
The thing that I'm trying to say is I don't know. Like I know the red deck's composition and how it wins a lot of these matchups like the back of my hand. I don't even know how I would construct a game plan. Right?
My plan would be to play the Sulfuric Vortex game, right? So just stop all their offense and have Vortex take care of the rest. Like that would be where I stand, because once again, like this deck actually has pretty middling offense. But again, if they board into Tempting Wurm, that's actually how I would use Grim, right? I would use Grim to like stack up against Tempting Wurm. Yeah, so that I can.
You're gonna run out of resources. They're gonna kill you.
No, I mean they probably will if they have survival Tempting Wurm, right? But if they don't, then I can be in a situation where I can plausibly shorten their ability to do anything else, because like they're going to be busy. They're going to be like birds, Wall of Roots, survival. First I have to get Baloth to make sure I don't die. Then I have to go get Tempting Wurm. Then I have to cast Tempting Wurm. Then I have to attack.
Get Baloth? It might not have any text because of survival because of Sulfuric Vortex.
Right. That's why it's my plan.
No, I think that they might just play 5/5s and kill you. That's what I'm saying, right? Like,
right, but then I can chump block. Then I can chump block with Mog Fanatic, right? I can chump block with Mog Fanatic, go +1. I can have the Grim if I'm in a situation where it makes sense. Then I can just chump with the Grim and then hit face, right? Like the Tempting Wurm still has to kill me, and like they don't have like any good tools for like stopping my chump blockers. I'm not saying that, and for what it's worth, Gibbons would just be useless here. Just have no text in this scenario, but still.
I mean, I'm having a hard time imagining actually dealing 20 this way. That's
yeah. It's hard. Don't get me wrong. The easiest way to deal 20 is Jackal Pup, and they've cut that off. The second easiest is Ball Lightning, and they've kind of done a decent job of cutting that off.
They either take the Ball Lightning because they don't care, or they just like, all right, this was an expensive shot on your part. I drew a card already.
But if the cards go your way, you could be in a situation where they're just a little bit too slow to get everything out. And like, I can see a world in which you get them down to like 8 and they finally stabilized. They've got all their stuff together. And then, they're at 8, you have a few cards in hand. They have a Baloth, and then, you can get them with the Baloth activation
I'm going to blow your mind on this one. If we're in a world where we don't have Jackal Pup, right? Like their Duress Cabal therapy gets a lot better.
Yeah, no, I mean,
we're not pressuring their life total. They just take Fire Blast. I mean, like they just bought 2 turns with one.
Yeah. No, don't get me wrong. It's good, but at least the guide says -4 Cabal therapy, -1 Graveborn Muse, - Withered Wretch, - Sadistic Hypnotist, -1 Birds, +4 Naturalized, +2 Engineered Plague, +2 Tempting Wurm.
Okay, Engineered 0% chance that I'm going to have Engineered Plague in my deck in this matchup seems horrendous. What are you going to name? Elemental?
Elemental, yeah.
I don't know, man. That seems... I mean, this just seems bad to me. I would just much rather have hand destruction. They don't have any Jackal Pups.
I mean, you can just keep your Cabal therapy and name Ball Lightning.
Yeah. It seems better.
Engineered Plague kills Grim Lavamancer or preemptively neutralizes Ball Lightning. Yeah.
I think the thing that I'm arguing is that I don't think the Grim Lavamancer will do very much because it doesn't have any fuel. But there's a problem with Grim Lavamancer sometimes where he just doesn't have any.
It only needs a few fetch lands and a couple spells to be above rate though for a card. Like when the first activation makes it a shock, every activation over there is above replacement. It's going to deal more damage than Price of Progress.
Yeah, Price of Progress, it's so weird because it's one of your all-stars against
regular. But so what would you play? Horrendous. What would you play instead of Grim Lavamancer?
I'd have it in my deck. I'm just saying, it's just super not exciting to me. Like,
well, it's in your deck, and this deck is boarding out some amount of air for 2 engineered play. It's not a huge investment, but again, like like maybe the Grim Lavamancer angle makes engineered play slightly better than Cabal Therapy. That's all I'm saying.
I'm just saying, like, the way that the red deck beats this kind of deck is to like chip shot a little bit with X, Y, and Z. Like sometimes you get the Jackal Pup draw and they have no defense, right? But usually you're just like, here's 2, here's 3, blah, blah, blah. Here's my big turn. You don't get any chip shot damage after like turn 3. That's 1, right? You can't really just be spending your burn cards to go to face, right? Like that's not a thing that you can do, or they could just beat you by just like getting a bow off, right? Like it's just a horrible exchange. That, and that you're finite on mana.
I've come back around. I think you just have Jackal Pup, and you just attack and you bolt the wall, and you just do everything you can.
You just have to hope.
If they draw 3 walls, it's going to be tough, right? But if you
honestly, you might be right.
If you have pup, like turn 1 pup, turn 2 bolt the thing, turn 3, maybe they have the second wall, but you land Sulfuric Vortex, and then you just keep attacking. So maybe it's fine.
The problem is the traditional line of attack, which is around Sulfuric Vortex and Price of Progress, is actively bad here because they just play the Tempting Wurm and kill you.
Yeah.
The Vortex helps them. But that's the thing.
Well, the Tempting Wurm, though, like, because the rest of their stuff starts getting blanked out, the Tempting Wurm is conceivably okay for you to double spell into. It's not the best thing in the world, but it's not going to, like, if you're going through this plan, it might actually be fine. If your opponent goes turn 2 Tempting Wurm, you're like, okay, I'll take the tempo, put the Sulfuric Vortex into play, and then spend my next turn burning, and then continue burning the battlefield until I can hit your face, until I can fire.
You're just gonna if you don't have a Grim Lavamancer, this plan doesn't work. B, you're just gonna run out of resources.
Yeah, you probably will run out of resources, but at least you'll be in a situation where your opponent can't just survival Baloth, Recurring Nightmare, Genesis type stuff, right? Like, because you're always losing then. So like it's actually kind of okay to be in a situation like because there's no Gear 3 anymore, right? So then you're actually playing a game that has to end sooner rather than later.
Okay, this has come full circle. I'm full circle on Tempting Wurm. I'm telling you, as bad as Tempting Wurm is in some other situations, I can't even imagine it being bad in this matchup.
I'm not debating it being it being bad. I'm actually saying that it might be the thing that you got going for you, right? And it might be that burn could conceivably be like, if you have the Tempting Wurm, they have the answer, right? So there's going to be like, you miss on the Tempting Wurm. That's going to happen 60% of the time. But
what if we play Tempting Wurm and burn for the mirror match? And like all the things that you're imagining Tempting Wurm being able to do against Dreadnought, which it doesn't do in the black-green matchup, maybe it does them in burn.
I'm 100% behind this.
This is
like the best thing that I've ever heard in my life. Tempting Wurm, burn them and worm them.
No, like obviously Tempting Wurm in the sideboard, but like in the mirror match, just like Tempting Wurm. What do you got, right?
GG.
But like because like the Dreadnought deck is just like sculpting this counterplay, right? They can't go off against you, against your like overloads or naturalizes, I guess overloads, pyroblasts, whatever. Just Tempting Wurm. They're like, fuck.
Yeah.
and they're like, even if they have the Dreadnought, they can't just concede 11 damage the next turn, right? Because you're just like, I am sending everybody, right? And like the Dreadnought's just like, even if they have it, they can't attack you. You might just 11 them. They're just dead.
Yeah, I'm in.
Worst podcast ever. Good conclusion.
Love Spy Colony.
This is I'm so down for fucking Tempting Wurm and burn now.
How did we not see this sooner?
This is insane.
It's so obvious.
And it just crushes 12-12. Like can you imagine a Tempting Wurm like on turn 3 with like a Pyroblast open?
We don't have enough green sources to have it early. So what's our sideboard? 4 Tempting Wurm, 4
We have to
naturalized,
play the fuck it we call probably
nine
strategy?
sources.
Yeah, I don't know. Dude, it's pre-modern. Roll the dice.
Yeah. Cyberpunker that shit.
Oh my god. This is the highlight of this podcast should be like, this is the worst podcast ever. But if you stay for the 3.5 hours, we get to a really good conclusion. Oh my god.
I think the title is just going to be Tempting Wurm.
I don't know, man. I would not have gotten through this podcast if I were a listener. I'd be like, these fuckers just yell at each other.
It is true. It is true. We do have to rein it in. I apologize. I apologize on that behalf. We did it last episode too. So
yeah, I mean, I was like, especially as it's like, what's the point of having a dick measuring contest, right? This doesn't produce anything, you know? But I'm just like reacting to you. And that's like, I don't know, I should have been better.
It's okay.
Just like I should have used my sadistic hypnotist this
It's
morning.
okay.
If I used my sadistic hypnotist this morning, we wouldn't even have this conversation.
Yeah, it's true.
Like, as usual, I'm the greatest pre-modern player in the world.
Yeah, that's how after a year and a half of this, we're still failing to learn any lessons. Also, including not taking any of the feedback that our close friends and loyal fans have given us. But I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how this. I wish we could get those 3 hours back. I'm sure our listeners do too. It's okay. This is what happens, right? Because I actually was just like, weekly release schedule. We kind of have to figure out. We actually kind of like, if we're gonna do weekly release, we actually we actually have to template stuff out because we might just like choose the wrong usage of time. But I don't know. It's fine. It is just what it is. It's important to get the shit out here, and then
would never lose the mirror match.
And then just whatever. If you didn't like this week's episode, maybe next week will be better. So that's where
if you didn't like this week's episode, I hope that your red deck opponent Tempting Wurms you and demolishes you with a 5/5 for 2.
Yeah, because what other matchups do we have Call the Herd in that Tempting Wurm wouldn't be better?
I mean, it's Call the Herd's better against Sword Splashers. It's better against grinding, right? But Call of the Herd in the mirror match, I mean, Tempting Wurm is 1,000 times better and doesn't trigger Call of the Herd. What are they going to do? Double block? You have Lightning Bolt and Incinerate. It's...
Yeah, it's pretty good.
It's so good.
I'm so in. Okay.
Right,
but we still don't play Green Red Burn, right? So we're still just playing Mono Red.
But now we would always win the mirror match.
You probably just take 1 damage from your Karplusan Forest, and maybe they just hit you. Maybe they just chump block. Maybe they just chump block with Mog Fanatic and hit you.
Stop yucking my yum. I'm
know.
super into this.
I'm into it too. Don't get me wrong. You can hear that I'm into it. All right, love Spy Colony.
Bye.
And we apologize.